Okay, let's get started. Good morning. My name is Tanya Williams, and I'm a visiting Dean of DEI and Leadership Development in the Office of Institutional Effectiveness at the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office. Thank you for joining us today for the second day of the Transforming Institutional Culture Through Effective Anti-Racist Practices Conference, sponsored by the Chancellor's Office and the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges. As was the case yesterday, we hope that these series of presentations and conversations will plant the seeds of innovation, inspire movement towards our shared vision, and empower each of us to work collectively and concurrently to create an inclusive environment where all students are served equitably. Building upon yesterday's panel, today's proceedings will focus our attention on how we might leverage DEI as a mindset and practice, as a lever to drive more equitable recruitment, hiring, and retention processes, and foster campus cultures that deploy data as one approach to identifying areas of acute educational inequities. Today, we will also have the opportunity to engage in critical inquiry and discovery, addressing some of the issues that surfaced yesterday and will likely emerge today in smaller group learning sessions organized by role. There will be breakout sessions for faculty, classified professionals, trustees, executives, middle leaders, and HR professionals. Before we begin, I want to share a few reminders for those who were with us yesterday and new details about the conference proceedings with those who have joined us today. Live closed captioning is available throughout the webinar and in the breakout sessions. The general proceedings will be recorded. Proceedings and resources will be made available through the Vision Resource Center. And we will notify all conference registrants when those materials are available. And finally, I want to encourage everyone to take a moment when requested to share feedback and complete a survey about your experience at the conference. Thank you again for your time and consideration. We're excited about the opportunity to learn, grow, and lead together. So at this time, I want to introduce the Executive Vice Chancellor of Educational Services and Support, Marty Alvarado, for opening remarks and leading the recruitment, retention, hiring, and performance review practices to advance anti-racist institutional panel, which she will also be joined by Cheryl Aschenbach, Secretary, Academic Senate of California Community Colleges, Michelle Velasquez-Bean, the Treasurer of the Academic Senate of California Community Colleges, and Wendy Brill Wynkoop, the President of the Faculty Association of California Community Colleges. Marty?
Great, thank you so much, Tanya. Let's go ahead and move our slides forward. I am thrilled to join you this morning. Good morning, and thrilled to be joined by this amazing panelist. I'd love to start this presentation with just a big shout out to all of the participants that are part of the task force that has been working on, I should say, this work to update performance review regulations and in order to advance anti-racist institutions. So big shout out to everyone who has been part of this work. Next slide, please. Okay, I love starting with a quote, and my colleagues found this amazing quote. What we are engaged in as we really lean into dismantling structural racism within our system and really leading the way in higher education is a culture change. And culture change happens one small activity at a time, whether that's changing policies, whether that's changing practices, whether that's increasing awareness, whether that's reflecting as individuals and changing our day-to-day practices and how we engage, All of that is part of the culture change that is required when an organization is actually going to transform. We thought this quote was especially significant given that it is from the former CEO of the Girl Scouts, and really understanding that everything needs to evolve as we really try to understand what we've internalized, how we show up day to day, and what that learning journey looks like for all of us as we go forward. So hope you enjoy this, hope you quote this. Culture changes when the organization is transformed, and that's our work today. Next slide, please. So what we will be walking through, and hopefully my part will be very quick, we really want to talk about the statewide enabling conditions that we're trying to create in order to ensure that campuses have clarity around expectations and what is required moving forward. And within those institutions, all of the individuals, the 90,000 plus employees across our system. We want to talk about why DEIA competencies and criteria, why we moved in that direction and what we've created there. I should also make sure to make explicit, you all probably know, but DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. That's that acronym. Examples, we want to provide you some examples of what DEIA competencies and criteria look like. We understand that this is new for all of us. And again, as our Deputy Chancellor likes to say, clarity is kindness. And so we want to make sure that we are being clear about expectations. And then we'll talk a little bit about the employee evaluations and tenure review regulations that this task force has been working on, and we anticipate moving forward, hopefully, to the March board meeting. Next slide, please. I want to spend some of our time this morning, again, very quickly, talking about our system's commitments. What is really driving this work? Why was this task force brought together? And how do we continue to make sure that we are living into the commitments that we have set for our system and for our students? One, obviously, part of our commitment is that this is required by law. Part of the Ed Code section 87100 requires a workforce that is continually responsive to the needs of a diverse student population. I won't read this slide to you, but I did want to make sure that we're hitting on that point. Our Ed Code requires that we have a workforce, 90,000 plus employees, that are continually responsive to the needs of a diverse student population, understanding that our student population is never going to be static. Every term it changes. We have new students coming in every term, and we need to continually adapt and make sure that we are being responsive to the students we have in front of us every single class, every single term. We also have a commitment to understand and ensure that what we are doing related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is really a driver for our educational achievement. Understanding that intrinsic connection, students that feel belonging, students that feel connected, students that are supported, are really going to be able to achieve their educational outcomes at much higher numbers. Third, understanding that this is a critical tool, right? So not only does DEIA have to drive what we do, it also is a critical tool for ensuring equitable educational access and outcomes. I want to make sure that I hit that point. It's one thing for it to be a nice to have. It's another thing for us to be intentionally focused on equitable educational access and outcomes. And that means that we have to be attending to who's not being included as we have gone forward. So next slide, please. What I want to lean into here, I love our commitments, our vision goals and our commitments. Hopefully everyone has seen this slide. You've seen it so much you can repeat it, without even having to see it. You have it printed above your desk, above your workstation, and refer to it regularly. But what I want to hit on here, most of you know the goals. We have some major student outcome goals that we are trying to achieve, but we recognize that, again, going back to that culture change, we're not going to be able to hit these goals unless we start doing things different. And so what does that difference need to be predicated on or be contingent upon? And what I want to hit on here are a couple of the commitments, 2, 3, and 5. I think they are super critical for the conversation we are about to have right now. One, we need to design with the students' experience in mind, right? And not just students generally, globally, but really understanding, again, that diversity of our students every term. It is an ongoing process. And so when we think about what does it mean to design with our students' experience in mind, it means that we are continually adapting and learning as well in order to understand who our students are that are right in front of us. Number three, we need to pair high expectations with high support. And this isn't just for students. This is for all of us as well. We sort of have talked about in our committee and task force that many of us were not DEIA majors when we went to school, nor has that been necessarily our career trajectory. And yet here we are having to lean in, learn up, and begin to practice these new ways of operating. And so what we want to make sure we are doing as we collectively go through this learning journey is pair high expectations with high support for all of us. And so that requires a lot of grace and a lot of support collectively. And then number five, we need to own our student performance as we really transition from the right to fail era and the policies and structures that were really set up in the right to fail era. We have to understand that all of that needs to shift as we own student performance and recognize that we have a critical role to play in ensuring that students are able to move forward with the least amount of friction points and removing all the unnecessary friction points that we have set up through that right to fail era. Right, so we are now firmly in the student support era, and we want to make sure that we are owning and contributing to student performance. Next slide, please. I won't spend a lot of time here. I will say guided pathways. This is all part of the guided pathways reform that we are committed to as we continue to go forward. Next slide, please. I believe this is our next commitment, is that we have a commitment to action. For those that may recall, June 2020, the Chancellor and the Chancellor's Office put out the call to action to make sure that we are focused on dismantling systemic racism and making sure that we are leaning into those commitments that we noted earlier. So in this, we have our commitment to action. What I want to call out here, the impetus and the prompt for what we have been doing is really in item 2 and 3. Looking at our campus climates and looking at our classroom climates. And how do we make sure that we are putting the right structures in place, that we are prompting action across the board to make sure that we are moving in that direction, as well as establishing those enabling conditions. Next slide, last slide before I hand it over. We did have an update in June of 2021 to our call to action, to our commitment to action, and I really want to call out number 8. We are going to align our investments and use our resources to achieve our equity priorities, right? Budgets are statements of values. I definitely stole that quote from other individuals who have said it much more eloquently. And I want everyone to remember that as we really think about how we move this forward. It's not a we can't, or it'll be hard, or we don't have the resources. It's about how do we make the choices we need to make in order to ensure that we are leaning into these priorities and that we are ensuring equitable access for all students and equitable support for all of our staff, faculty, administrators to ensure that they have what they need to be able to do this work effectively and be on this learning journey with all of us. So with that, I would love to, next slide, hand it over to the amazing Cheryl Aschenbach to get us, to help us jump into the content.
Thank you so much, Marty. Really appreciate it. And good morning, everybody. As we do this work, and Marty noted this in the very beginning, there was a large group of people who were involved in this work to start with. We just have this unique opportunity to discuss it with you today and to share the group's work. But I also want to acknowledge that starting with the DEI implementation work group, representation from across our system, and absolutely diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility champions. And within that group, we engaged in a continuous process of learning and growth, and acknowledging that, you know, we all fall short a little bit, and we live in that discomfort, examine it, and learn to grow from it. And so, you know, want to encourage all of you to invest in this work for all the reasons that Marty has said, but also acknowledge that it's not always easy. But the group undertook this work to really explore what can we do to embed DEI within our system as we go, and more importantly, within our campus and college climates. Next slide, please. Within the work that the work group did, developing competencies criteria was really deemed necessary. In order to transform culture, we have to look at what's expected of each of us as employees within the system, and the work that we do not only with students, but with each other. Ultimately, the competencies and criteria we're going to talk about are meant to define what it means to be intentional as equity-centered employees and as anti-racist practitioners in the California community colleges. And through that, what skills, knowledge, behaviors will we employ to demonstrate that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in action, no matter our role as we work, teach, and lead. While the work relative to the competencies was first focused on redesigning employee evaluations and tenure to be inclusive of DEIA, really when we think about the framework and skills that resulted, and we're going to look at as competencies and criteria, those are applicable in general, just to better define our systemic expectations for what it means to be equity-minded, to be inclusive, to be respectful for diversity, and to be accessible and offer accessible education. And this can certainly feed into the language we use and the expectations we set in job announcements, in what we expect to see from prospective employee applications, and ultimately, throughout the screening and selection process. And then once we're employees, it's a place to give us that constant check back to see where are we on our own journeys and how are we meeting the expectations of the system. And the competency criteria we're going to talk about are not absolute. These are recommendations and a starting point for the system. Through this all, and we're going to hear a little bit more later, we certainly encourage colleges to engage in dialogue locally. And you might use these as a starting point to say, what does DEIA look like in action for our employees on a local level? The subgroup, so the DEI implementation work group is a large group. It's been in doing its work for, I think, 3 years now. And within that, as we recognize the need to do work around employee evaluation and tenure review, we established a subgroup. And again, a very inclusive group, broad roles and perspective represented, with the academic senate and there for faculty, with classified present through CSEA, chief instructional officers, chief executive officers, student service officers, business officers, and important partners, our HR officers, along with personnel from the chancellor's office and the Success Center. And I have to give credit to the Success Center personnel who so expertly facilitated so many of our sessions. But we pulled a subset of us out and formed a subgroup where really we realized that we had to engage together, that this establishing competency criteria needed to be a process. And so we engaged in inquiry together. We explored how DEIA is integrated into faculty evaluations in other institutions of higher education, primarily universities across the nation. And then more specifically, how some of our community college districts are approaching this work in California. Part of that included hearing how the Academic Senate, Faculty Union, and Human Resource personnel in the Los Rios district approach their work to regularly engage together, acknowledge the tensions and boundaries in having these dialogues and doing this work, and establish intentions in order to continue to productively engage in DEIA dialogue. They acknowledged, as we all do, it's not an easy feat, but it's critical work that we have to do to support our students and ultimately lead to that ability to support diverse student needs. The subgroup's inquiry and learning also included a review of current statutes and regulations relative to employee evaluations and tenure review. And I think for all of us, probably outside of our HR professionals, that was an incredible opportunity to learn and dive a little more deeply into what statute and regulations say. Throughout its work, we repeatedly acknowledged how important it is to frame employee evaluations as a continual effort of professional growth. This effort, anytime we started to think that this work could be interpreted as a way to take punitive action against employees for not practicing DEIA behaviors or skills, we reinforce within each other and we'll continually message outside that this is about professional growth, that nobody is to the point of being, ultimately DEIA capable, that we're all on our own journeys and we're just in different places. And so, including this effort, especially in evaluations and tenure review, is meant to acknowledge that journey and that space for growth and to support that rather than to serve as a punitive measure. Embedding DEIA into evaluations using the competencies and criteria lets us frame expectations of employees from recruitment to retirement. And it can serve as a way to recognize those who are already far along their journey and use them as models and engage with them, as well as to provide a framework for growth for those that are at different points. As the subgroup met, we advanced from the position of inquiry and learning together to facilitating activities to generate specific lists of what we thought it meant to be DEI related in practice or DEI skilled in practice, no matter our role. We then took that feedback into a competencies and criteria, which we'll look at in a moment, that we repeatedly shaped over the course of a number of meetings. Next slide, please. This slide notes 6 meetings, but I think we actually had 1 or 2 more. But along this journey, this was our roadmap. We created this from the start, and then we adapted a little bit as we went. But again, it was a journey, individually and collectively. And it was important for us as a group to always collaborate and have a safe space that we could do that collaboration and experience that growth in. I think in this sense, our effort and the result really serves as a model for how local districts and colleges can engage cross-campus personnel to participate in the identification of a local set of DEIA competencies and criteria. Together, we listened, we engaged, we revised, and then we started again. We listed, we reviewed, we listened, we revised, we engaged. And so what we have and what went to the Board of Governors is not a final set of competencies and criteria. It's meant as a starting point. And the mechanisms will be in place, and that'll be touched on a little bit later, to revisit the list regularly and update the competencies and criteria as needed. And again, they're meant to be a recommendation and a starting point for colleges to consider and use. Next slide, please. Again, just the purpose of establishing the DEIA competencies is really to define the skills, knowledge, and behaviors that we as community college employees must demonstrate to work, teach, and lead in our diverse environment, and where we celebrate and can be inclusive of diversity. I mean, we kept that at our center point. That was our guiding star. And we ask that you continue to think about it in that respective too. Next slide, please. As we did our work, we kept a few principles in mind, and really, I've mentioned each of these that we're thinking through what skills, knowledge, and behavior should be present. How can we as employees demonstrate our growth and challenge ourselves by being self-reflective to do that growth? And how can we make sure that these are embedded into DEIA and our current expectations with a growth mindset? We really have to, just as we expect to take a growth mindset with our students, let's take that with our employees as well, not in any way meant to be punitive. And that if we are, have the ability to dive into a more specific set of competencies and criteria, then we have something that's easier to measure and ultimately kind of evaluate and assess for personal growth than it would be just to consider, who innately is inclusive and respectful and doing the DEIA work versus those who aren't. Next slide, please. So we keep referring to competencies and criteria, and we see that as two different levels. The competencies really are intended to kind of frame the work and provide the high level kind of expectations or baseline for what it means to be a DEIA practitioner in our system. And then the criteria can serve to have more discrete details. And, this is where both have a lot of opportunity for local further development within our own environments, maybe even within our own, office workspaces or classroom spaces. We can dive a little more deeper to say, what does this look like in practice? But each was divided as we kept, giving ourselves feedback, exploring our input. Everything got filtered into different themes, and you'll see 6 themes across the DEIA competencies. And then Michelle will explain that there's 7 themes across the criteria. Within those competencies, all of them apply to all employee groups, faculty and staff being used collectively for everyone who's not faculty, with the exception of DEI pedagogy and curriculum. And I think we can all recognize that that's very specific to faculty, but it certainly can touch on other groups as they work closely with faculty and students in the classroom in that environment of student learning. So let's look a little bit more at what the competencies are. Next slide, please. So again, acknowledging that higher level framework for the knowledge and behaviors that we need to demonstrate in order to work, teach, and lead in our diverse environment. And so with those 6 themes, let's dive in. Next slide, please. 1, cultural competency. I think in each of these, we have a chance to kind of self-reflect and ask ourselves questions. Do we acknowledge that cultural, and social identities are diverse and that they're fluid and that there's intersectional aspects of that? And with that, are we aware of the relevance of all of that fluidity and identity on the work that we do and on the structures of oppression and marginalization within our systems? Do we understand the lived experience, and are we seeking to understand the lived experience of our students, our colleagues, and our communities? Do we seek and do we acknowledge that we need to be anti-racist, and do we seek ways to be more anti-racist in our thoughts and actions? Really, what does it mean to be culturally competent at a high level? When we think about self-improvement, looking a little bit at, are we self-reflecting? Are we, just as we should be doing in the function of our role, are we continually seeking to improve, to adapt, to become a better employee than we were yesterday? And in this case, are we self-reflecting and doing that? And are we self-improving in ways that are DEI focused and are equity centered? Do we have a commitment to that continuous improvement? Relative to inclusion, equity, pedagogy, as faculty members, are we promoting and incorporating DEI principles and anti-racist pedagogy into our classroom? Are we being culturally appropriate? Do we consider and accommodate for all the diverse learning styles that we work with? And, are we using holistic humanistic assessment? Are we continually, again, blending with self-improvement? Are we continually participating in training to continue to affirm and improve and advance our pedagogy in culturally affirming and culturally advancing ways? Next slide, please. Within the DEI mission, are we centering our work and recognizing, looking at the context that Marty laid out so well? Do we frame the work we do in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility? Do we think about that impact in the work we do with students and the interactions we have with colleagues? Is it apparent in all that we do? It should be central, as Marty so very capably explained. Are we using data to uncover inequitable outcomes? Are we asking questions to dive deeper into the data that we're given, or do we take it at face value? Do we, call out racialized patterns and look at policies and procedures to see how they could be amended and improved to be anti-racist, inclusive, and truly to honor and respect our diversity? These are all questions we can be asking within these competency categories, and then give us a place to grow from. Next slide, please. So with that overarching competency level, looking at those 6 themes, let me now hand it over to Michelle to look a little bit more closely at the behaviors, actions, and skills that folks can have and be demonstrating through the competencies, or through the criteria rather.
Thank you, Cheryl, so much. Thank you. Well, yes, I'm pumped, right? But I know, here we are this morning, and these competencies, these framing, these themes that you see here in that top part of the graphic. And now, I can imagine out there in the virtual world, as there's, over 300 of us on this call, people are saying, these all sound really great, right? This, yes, but, what about when there's reservation? How do we do this? Because there's all kinds of fear, right? And this is the work of anti-racism. My mentor and amazing friend, Mayra Cruz, always says, as Cheryl had alluded to, this is heart work, right? So what do we do well as colleagues, professors, staff, people engaged in higher ed, in as Chancellor Oakley always says, the largest higher ed public system in the country. So how do we do that? If we all want to, I know that at some point, all of us wanted to become educators or wanted to be in education because we wanted to serve others. So those framing at the top of that graphic, I know and believe, especially you all here on the call, you believe in these, and these are hard work. But now how do we get to, okay, doing this? Logically, what are those details as Cheryl was just speaking about? So that bottom part of the graphic that you see there, these are 7 themed areas that I'm gonna hopefully kind of go by quick, because I see that we're already getting in the middle of our timing here. But I do feel like it's important to give some ideas of what that criteria for framing those competencies can actually look like. So on the next slide, if we go to the next slide, you'll see this is just saying that these are for all employees of the California Community College system. As Vice Chancellor Alvarado was saying earlier, this is already required. Now, how do we do that at a deep level? Again, sitting with that discomfort of this is hard work, because we are whole human beings. So yes, we're very good at the logic and the mind, the rational. How now do we invest that whole being of us, that emotion and that willingness to get to that growth that Cheryl was talking about, that self-awareness? So yes, every single one of us can invest in this. And how do we do that? And you'll see on the next slide, we can go to the next slide. These are specific examples for activities for all of employees in our system to do. And these are guiding, like Cheryl was saying, guiding and supporting as we look at evaluating and looking at our own tenure review process. So one of the areas is service. So when we talk about service, what we mean specifically there is like your service to the institution, to the community, to your professional organizations. So for example, I'll give you some concrete examples. So do you invest in us when we're doing these evaluations, looking at, and again, not punitive, but encouraging, are we then participating as an employee of the California Community College System in diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility groups, committees, community activities, those that promote cultural change, that look at systemic racism through the lens of supporting historically marginalized communities, those that have been left on the margin, and those groups that we want to serve in our community to eliminate those equity gaps. So things like affinity associations are great, both local and statewide. We have Colegas, we have Amend, we have Apahi. There's so many I know that I'm probably not listing, but those are the kinds of things we're looking at in service and recommending to be looked at in evaluations. And then number two, when we look at pedagogy and curriculum, as Cheryl was already speaking about, this is looking at how an employee contributes and develops curriculum and practices through a race-conscious lens and an intersectional lens. So yesterday, if you were on the call, we heard a great presentation from Long Beach City College about their curriculum audits. That could be a concrete example of that. Also, you know, ASCCC, we have the OER rubric that looks at things from a race-conscious and inclusive and accessible lens. We have articles and resources from the ASCCC on looking at your COR through a race-conscious, culturally responsive lens. All of these kinds of things, affirming cultural responsiveness, pedagogy and practices, those are the things that we're looking for in all learning spaces, right? Not just classrooms, but being that warm and welcoming front-facing staff as students walk in is part of what we do, right? It may not be specific to curriculum, but it's specific in that it's part of the instruction and the practices. So libraries, learning spaces, counseling offices, those are all part of our curriculum in a sense as well. So investing in those representational and diversity elements. Three, you'll see their professional development. And really this is professional learning, right? To use that asset-based language, you're committing and you're seeing when you're evaluating or you're looking at employees in our system, how has that individual really invested in professional learning opportunities that advance DEIA and anti-racism practices? So really this is, friends, I'm gonna be real here. This is not being race neutral. This is not being colorblind. This is being intentional about centering our work in our personal learning and growth towards our anti-racist journey, right? Everyone on a different place, so no shame, no blame, no punitive. But yes, it feels a little like sometimes it's like, ooh, this is like judgment. Well, it's more like shifting that mindset to a self-awareness. Where am I and how can I do better? So that's that professional learning. And then 4 at the bottom of the slide there, employee interactions. This is the example of recruiting, hiring, and retaining diverse faculty and staff. So looking at minoritized community, Black, Indigenous people of color, and be on those hiring committees. So let's say that you don't have, you aren't necessarily the person doing the actual hiring, but what about being on the hiring committees? And then reviewing things like the ASCCC model hiring practices and principles as a framework for interacting that way on these committees and in promoting the respect and the equitable outcomes on our campus for having a diverse employee population, fostering those positive environments so that we can be open-minded, showing respect and compassion and empathy for everyone on our campus, because that's really what it's all about. That's that heart work. So on the next slide, we have our 5th element, which is self-assessment. So again, we keep talking about this. It's this continuous cycle of self-assessment for your own personal growth. And sometimes I'm gonna be real with you. When my mentor, Mata Cruz, would say, Michelle, well, have you really thought about it? And I'm like, ooh, wait a minute, I could do better. So it's not a shame or a blame. It's just looking at ourselves and saying, okay, what can we do so that I can uncondition some of that internalized bias and because we all have bias. We all have bias in some way. But it's about looking at, okay, there's in our system and the way we've done things in our country, just acknowledging that there's this element of racial superiority and there shouldn't be, or racial inferiority. So looking at and acknowledging that and then doing better. Using things like our Vision Resource Center, implicit bias, and I don't see color modules, and maybe even taking your own self-assessment from the project Implicit from Harvard. Those are things that you can do even on your own, that you can start now in addressing these criteria before we even get to the evaluation part, right? Because then people will be able to see that who are evaluating or reviewing you, that yes, we are investing in this way. And then number 6, the DEI environment. This here, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and accessibility, this is promoting that and acknowledging that there has been some harm done. So it's not necessarily just being the false hope cheerleader. No, acknowledge that there has been harm done, even if you unintentionally contributed to it or wasn't even aware that we perpetuate those systems. So it's about working to do better to create those safe spaces, those diversity, equity, and inclusion environments. And then the last one, 7, connected to the mission. This is articulating and connecting in your own work to your own institution's mission. And hopefully all of our colleges have in our mission statements that we are working towards being anti-racist institutions, right? As Cheryl was alluding to, we continually work on that. There's no arriving. It's a cyclical process when we're talking about self-awareness, both at the personal and the institutional level. So that's that continuous improvement and creating those cycles to do that and connecting it to the mission and to the vision for success. So if we go to that next slide, I think it's passing it over to Vice Chancellor Alvarado, who will give us some examples of how we're going to do this in the Title V regulations and what's coming up soon to solidify these competencies for DEIAA in our system and structures. Vice Chancellor Alvarado.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Next slide, please. I see a lot of questions and comments in the Q&A, so thank you for putting those out there. Keep them coming. This is going to be a lot of conversation. This is a starting point. I want to emphasize this is a starting point. This is a starting conversation, and it's an uncomfortable conversation as we go forward. So would love to put a little bit of context around this before we keep going forward. There were some questions around regulations and requirements and some of the inherent challenges, given that we are still working within environments where there is a lot of implicit and explicit bias that we see permeate our systems. So what the new regulations will do as we go forward, and just to be clear, the expectation is that, or the goal, I should say, is that these new regulations, proposed regulations, would go to the March board meeting. During that time, there is an established process for public comment, both pre-board meeting and at the board meeting. It goes for first read at March. We anticipate making adjustments based on the feedback we receive through that process. And then it goes back in May or July, depending on the timeline and the changes required for final read and action. And then it goes to the state. So we're still talking about 8 months to a year before anything gets fully implemented, with the first starting point being getting these regulations out for the public to review and to weigh in on, just to calibrate folks in terms of the timeline. And what this really is designed to do, again, given some of the comments and concerns that have surfaced, is to set the minimum standard, to set the enabling conditions. So what you see in this sort of rainbow here on the slide is that you have colleges that are deeply immersed in the implementation, boots on the ground, the realities of evaluation. We don't do evaluation for employees at the state level. And so really recognizing that there are multiple layers where action has to happen. And so the action that is appropriate for the state and the Board of Governors was really engaging associations, districts, and colleges in in the conversation around how do we establish those enabling conditions that begin to create the momentum and the expectation that this is what we are doing as a system. It does not dictate how things get implemented. It does not take away the power at the local level. It merely sets the minimum standards and expectations for what we as a system will be engaged in over the future years to come. So it establishes these minimum conditions for employee evaluations and tenure review. How that gets implemented is a local level decision. What you just heard about in terms of competencies and criteria was really to take out some of the guessing work and it can mean different things for different people, and really try to put some form and examples and substance around what do we mean when we say DEIA focused competencies, evaluation and tenure review. And then I think, so the other piece of this, sorry, making sure I don't forget anything. The other piece of this is recognizing that this is ongoing work. Again, that this is the starting point. There is going to be a need for ongoing support and challenges and resources related to implementation. And so that is what we will need to continue to surface as we go forward. What are the PD needs? What are the PD professional development needs? What are the resource needs? What sort of additional toolkits or professional development trainings or content is needed? What type of resources will be needed as colleges wrestle with implementation? So we are very grateful to be working with a number of associations as part of the committee, and they all had work plans related to implementing this work and advancing this work. And then we'll continue to work with districts and colleges as we navigate post moving forward the regulations and getting into the implementation stage. I also just want to emphasize that some colleges are already much farther down this path, and the work group heard from institutions that are trying to move this work forward outside of any new regulatory requirement. So again, colleges are in different stages, colleges and districts are in different stages, and we will be working with everyone in order to scaffold. Next slide, please. And I will hand it over, I believe, to Wendy.
Good morning, everyone. And we're a little, I know, over time, so I will try and go quickly without missing anything. So I joined this work group sort of in the middle as I became the president of FAC. And you know, this is not work that I was either familiar with or necessarily comfortable with. And the reason I bring that up is because I found the work group to be this unbelievable safe space to have these really hard conversations. So I joined as the work group was wrapping up the competencies and criterias, writing those, and we are segueing into making these recommendations for Title V. And I really found the process, this beautiful balance between being thoughtful and taking time to reapproach the current regulations and thoughtful ideas about what new regulations might be needed, with this balance of a sense of urgency to make progress on the work, right? Because if we just simply talk about it forever, then the work will never get done. So in late spring, May, we started to review existing law and Title V sections. We had rounds of discussion and submitting input before the work group arrived at its recommendations. And then I know we've already heard this, Marty just said it, but just to be clear, the work group made recommendations for new and revised regulations, Title V regulations, and then the language actually will be drafted by the lawyers and not the work group members, and then it'll move through the public comment period with at least 2 readings at the Board of Governors. So I'm talking about recommendations that the work group made as opposed to the actual language of the Title V revisions. And I think that what I heard repeated through the work group time and time again is that really to support our diverse system, that we really need to make sure that these competencies are called out as a bare minimum for all employees within the system, that it wasn't just the work of the faculty or the staff, but that to make sure our students feel included and welcomed, that we needed to make sure that all employees were held to these competencies and standards. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the DEI implementation work group proposed Title V changes to existing regulation to include the new DEI competencies and criteria in all evaluations and tenure. The changes will include intentional language adopted from the DEIA competencies and criteria framework that was developed by the work group. And the developed, excuse me, the developed criteria and competencies represent the minimum standard for local districts, and we hope that many districts will move beyond these minimum standards. The intent was to start with this common understanding and set point for all employee types, and employees really needed a clear definition of expectations and criteria. The work group agreed that both the evaluatee and evaluators should be given professional development training or professional learning on the meaning of cultural competencies and the ways in which it can be demonstrated and assessed. I saw that as a question in the Q&A. Yes, we all need training to make sure we understand how to evaluate each other and talk about it. But also it's incredibly important that the work is focused on self-reflection, development, improvement, and not punitive in nature. Additionally, that these criteria and competencies cannot be static, that as we do this work to transform our system, these competencies and criteria will need to be updated on a regular schedule, and our recommendation was every 3 years. So as the criteria and competencies are updated, then the related materials, such as our handbooks, minimum qualifications handbook, EEO practices handbook, and the PCAW will also need to be revised as the cultural competencies and criteria are also revised. Next slide, please. So the proposed regulatory action would amend 9 existing sections. That's our recommendation from the committee. And we'll also add new sections and with intentional language that demonstrates the system's commitment to recruiting, hiring, and retaining diverse faculty, staff, and administrators to reflect the institution's commitment to DEIA through upskilling and maintaining a diverse workforce to positively impact student outcomes. So these regulation changes are intended to strengthen our commitments by updating existing regulations with intentional and clear language that promotes transformable change, supports our institutional change culture, and supports the upskill of employees with an emphasis on equity practices and behaviors. They're also intended to establish expectations that all employees must possess DEIA competencies to work, teach, and lead in the system. They're intended to hold districts, colleges, and employees accountable through objective standards and support a developmental cycle of growth and learning rather than punitive. They're intended to cross-reference relevant and related Title V sections with new regulations on employee evaluations and tenure review to ensure alignment. I wanted to particularly note that we see a lot in Title V, current Title V regulations. We see the language used, sensitivity to and understanding of diversity, and the DEI work group really felt that this is something that needed to be changed. We've heard it for many years, those of us who've worked in the system. And the work group had suggested language that I'd like to read, and I quote, change this sensitivity to an understanding of to, quote, a demonstrated understanding of the lived experiences of diverse students, employees, and communities served by the community colleges, and positive work-related contributions to equitable outcomes and meaningful inclusion for individuals from diverse communities. So these work group recommendations made by members will now are now going to legal, as I said, and hopefully we will see what they look like in a short period of time in March at the Board of Governors. And we look forward to more conversations as a system as a whole to make sure that we can actually do this work. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Michelle.
Oh, wow. Ben, I mean, you're out there in the virtual world. I can see the friends here on the webinar screen, but I just like want to hug you all. Like, don't you feel like, okay, like I know I'm ready. I'm pumped. I'm excited. You all ready? Let's be ready. Let's be agents of change. It's time, right? Think about how many decades we've been doing equity work. And now let's really do racial equity, really looking at inclusion, accessibility, anti-racism. It's time to invest in doing right. It's time to invest in putting action behind words. You know, after the murder of George Floyd, many of us put in pledges and statements. Let's put action behind those words. Let's move from passion to purpose. Administrators, put your position and power on the line. Put resources, amplify Black, Indigenous, people of color voices. Faculty, use your tenure and your academic freedom for change. Don't wait for these DEI regs to come out. Do it now. Staff, classified professionals, brilliant. You always are supporting and hardworking with our operations. Use your collective voice. Trustees, embrace catalyst of change that you are, shifting those ideas from this isn't dangerous, this is necessary for growth. Invest in that spirit of inquiry to really put behind that meat that we have and we need and that we're yearning for as anti-racist institutions that we long to be. Students, your stories are beautiful. Demand us to hear them. Demand us to implement and act on these DEIAA competencies and criteria, that we're not posturing or pretending, but we're activating, and we value you for you as the incredible leaders and beautiful human beings that you are, that we want to come alongside and be co-conspirators with you, co-creators as we dismantle these inequities and build accountability. This is our start, and we mean it. And I know some of you on the line, you're like 100%, yes, let's do this. And then there's some maybe not so much 100%, and that's okay. I'd like to leave you with a few words, and I know that we're running late on time, but I think these are powerful. These are Amanda Gorman's words from her powerful poem, The Hill That We Climb. I don't know if you could see that, but I'm going to end here, and then I'm going to introduce another colleague. As we compose a system committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gaze not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first. We must put our differences aside. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. For while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. Our people, diverse and dutiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it. Be the change, colleagues. I'm going to introduce to you a change agent, a co-conspirator, a white male ally who has been an inspiration of innovation, a man willing to get out of the way and amplify Black, Indigenous people of color, one who willingly and intentionally works to dismantle bias and inequities in our system. I hand it over to Vice Chancellor Greg Smith. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. It is both inspiring and terrifying to follow Michelle in a presentation. When she first came and represented the Academic Senate and the DEI Implementation Work Group, I remember telling everybody, we are blessed to have Michelle here because if you ever need a shot of enthusiasm, of positivity, she will absolutely give it to you. And so it's been an absolute pleasure, Michelle, to be part of this experience with you. I want to thank Vice Chancellor Alvarado, Cheryl, and Wendy also for providing such an excellent foundation for what I'm about to share with you, which is going to focus on how data and evidence can help us change culture with our institutions. before we get into the main content here, if we can jump ahead to the next slide, Brian, I want to set kind of a foundation of some terminology that we use in this. This comes from the DEIA glossary of terms. The DEI implementation work group did a lot of work a couple years ago to put this together, and you can find this on the Chancellor's Office website. If you just do a search for CCO, DEIA glossary of terms, it'll be one of the first results that come up for you. But when we talk about anti-racism, what do we mean? Right? We mean intentionally engaging in the work to create policies that are designed to lead to racial equity, that are intentionally substantiated by anti-racist ideas. So it's not an accidental byproduct. It's something that we set out and designed with that end in mind. When we talk about culture, I think we're really talking about the intersection of what do our institutional structures tell us we have to do? What are the rules? What does Title V, what does Ed Code, what do our board policies, APs, handbooks say we must do? And then how do we choose to behave? We all have mission statements and vision statements and value statements in our college, but do we actually align our work to those statements or not? Those behaviors, what becomes acceptable, what becomes normal within our institution, define our culture. And so if we're going to talk about culture change, we have to understand we're talking about the way that we and our peers, our colleagues, engage in our work, engage with each other socially at work. And so if we're going to change that culture in an organization, we've got to come up with new methods of operating and reorient ourselves within those structures. How will my behavior change in order to pursue the outcomes we have set as an institution are critical to who we are and what we want to do? Who are we serving? Who are the student communities that we're aligning our resources to ensure their success? How do I need to act in order to facilitate? Jumping ahead to the next slide, a few more key terms that we want to talk about. What does it mean to be equity-minded? I draw your attention to the second half of this. 5 things. We need to be race conscious. We need to be thinking about our institution as the focus. What do we do collectively? Who do we serve? Who benefits? Who's left out? We need to be evidence-based. We need to be systematically aware, and we need to be action-oriented. It's not enough to define the problem. It's not enough to see the problem. And that's what the data is going to help us do. It's what do we do with that information? How do we give it meaning? How do we choose to act? We need to be able to understand what institutional racism is and when we see it. And we're going to get into that in a little more depth here shortly. Ultimately, we use that information to reorient ourselves to pursue racial justice. And that is systematic fair treatment of people from all races. We need to define what fair treatment is and look at that. We need to decide what equitable opportunities and outcomes mean for us, define that, and then be able to reorient ourselves to pursue that. And understand we're not just talking about the absence of discrimination. I heard Michelle talk about, this is not about creating a colorblind institution. This is an institution that absolutely sees the color, the lived experience of every person that comes into it, as an employee, as a student, as a community member, as our stakeholders, and we value that. It's not the absence of discrimination, it's pursuing equity as our goal explicitly. So as we talk about some of these terms, I just wanted to make sure that you understood the way that I'm using them, that you can see at the very bottom of the screen there, the direct link. You can go find this. I would encourage you to have that available. It can help facilitate conversation. And some people have come into the Q&A already and pointed out, we have to be able to engage with people that are on a spectrum in this work, who may not have already decided that for them, this is important. And so having common terminology and exposing them to these terms and ideas becomes an important part of their journey, and we can help facilitate that as partners. So please use this tool. Jumping ahead to the next slide, and I'm going to start first by sharing an important story in my journey. I heard Vice Chancellor Alvarado talking about, as we looked at performance evaluations, and Cheryl mentioned this as well, that we are all kind of on a continuum. And I was in a conversation with some trustees. They invited ACRO, the HR organization that I'm representing, to join them in working on the way that we use data and hiring outcomes. And I met a trustee, Barbara Calhoun from the Compton Community College District. And at the start of the meeting, we were just all chatting, getting to know each other. And she asked me, as someone in HR, why do we continue to have personally identifiable information in our applications? Why do committees see the names and information about an applicant that can give them clues about their race, their gender, and their identity, when we know that that can lead to bias, explicit bias, implicit bias? And for me, it was almost muscle memory. I've had this conversation so many times. I immediately said, well, our application systems, a lot of them don't allow us to just pull that information out. We ask applicants to attach documents like their resume and their CV and reference letters, and we would have to individually go in and remove that. She cut me short, stopped me in my tracks, and said, no, I understand all those reasons. Plenty of organizations have started doing this. Why are we not doing it? And I had to stop and pause. And sometimes when we're doing this work, we need to talk less and listen more. And it was such an important moment because I realized that I was participating in the exact thing that I had been talking with so many others about not doing, which is don't just immediately justify the status quo. Yeah, there are great reasons why we don't do that. Are any of those reasons as good as the reason to start removing that information? And that is to ensure that every applicant coming in there is being evaluated objectively, to remove the markers that allow us to perpetuate discriminatory outcomes or a lack of equity in outcomes, even if we don't mean to discriminate. There are such strong stereotypes in our culture around race, gender, ability status, that it influences our thinking. And if we could do something to take that away, why aren't we doing it? It's going to be difficult. We're going to have to reallocate resources. We're going to have to spend money in areas that we didn't spend it before. We may need to hire more staff. Isn't that important enough to us? And that's really what she was asking me in that moment. Why isn't that important enough to you? And I'm so grateful that Barbara challenged me in that moment and gave me time to sit and think through that. I immediately went back and started working with my colleagues in HR on how do we solve this problem? How do we provide tools to our system on how to actually do this and to stop using resource allocation as an excuse, to stop using the amount of work that would need to go in it as an excuse, and to start delivering results. So I think this is where, setting a theme for what I'm going to share with you over the next 20, 25 minutes is that the data is one thing. It's a tool. What we choose to do with it is the most important thing. Data helps us see what is, but we give that data meaning. We decide whether or not it should prompt us to take action. It can make us aware of what exists now. It can help us think about what we want to become in the future. We decide if we're going to take action to get there. Are we going to now engage in strategic planning, set a vision, set a goal, an objective, an outcome, and align our actions to achieve it? Is it going to influence the way that we do allocate our resources? And are we going to fundamentally change our behavior as we engage to pursue more equitable outcomes across our system? So let's get to the primary content. Going on to the next slide. The main thing I want to talk about is how we do this in the hiring process. But I want to set the context for kind of a very real scenario that we see. We collect data on a lot of different things as colleges. And so here's one example. If we look at which students persist through our enrollment process from the moment that they express interest in coming and taking classes, getting through financial aid, registration, to being able to show up in class on the first day. And a lot of us see disparate outcomes. And so in this example, I said at this college, 85% of the individuals who identify as white complete the enrollment process. 52% of the individuals who identify as Hispanic or Latinx complete that process. As we look at structures in place, we see that we do provide Spanish language forms, instructions, marketing materials, but only in paper hard copies. You have to actually come into the building to see those. Our online content is only in English. We look at where we go and do outreach to potential students. And we see that among our local high schools, the majority of our resources are going to high schools with larger white student populations. We're putting fewer resources in our high schools serving our Hispanic and Latinx student populations. These are features of the way that we've been doing business. So the question is, what meaning do we give to this? And as we jump to the next slide, kind of like I did when Barbara said, why aren't we removing this information from our applications? We tend to start to rationalize or justify. And one of the most common things that I hear is that we give students the same. They all have the same access. They all have the same opportunity. This is the foundation of equal employment opportunity when we think about it in the hiring context. Everybody gets the same. Your outcome is up to you. If you didn't succeed in it, that's more on you than it is on us. I think we have to fundamentally take that out of our vocabulary in its entirety and take responsibility, even if it's more responsibility than really belongs with us. Yes, each person bears some responsibility for their own outcomes. But if we as an institution say that we are going to be vigorously committed to helping students succeed, to identifying all the barriers and getting rid of them, and recognizing that students of color, students with disabilities, students from populations and communities that have been marginalized by our systems need our focus explicitly, then we get rid of this excuse. We no longer use this to justify outcomes. We go forward, we look at, well, if we look at the majority of our students, the way that we're allocating resources, our resources are in a proportion with our students. Or we might have issues like we don't have enough IT resources, we don't have the staff, we don't have the technology in order to be able to make our online processes available in multiple languages. Are those excuses going to be justifications that allow us to say the status quo needs to stay the way it is and we're fine with it? Or do these become the strategic objectives we need to set in order to achieve change? That's culture change for us, right? So jumping ahead to the next slide, changing that mindset. So giving the data meaning. As we look at that example, some of us are immediately thinking that's what institutional racism looks like. That's it in its most explicit form right now. That we've allocated resources in a way that benefits one group based on their racial identity over another group. And I've reiterated the definition of that. Others are looking at that same information and saying, that's not institutional racism to me. And we need to have that conversation. We need to engage both sides of that and talk through this. I think it's so important that we invite skeptics into this conversation. There's been a lot of questions coming into the Q&A about how we might do that or the barriers that the skepticism out there creates. We're never going to change a mind by excluding people, right? We've got to draw them in, and we've got to be open to hearing their skepticism and ask them to be open to hearing why we think that this is a problem that needs our immediate attention, that justifies rethinking the way that we do things. Engaging in that conversation, I think, is how we chart our way forward and change our culture. Jumping ahead, with that context then, I think an important part of this is, as we go into kind of the strategic planning part of this, and Brian, we can go ahead to the next slide, that we want to set a strategic direction. And so looking at that example, we might say, okay, this is our priority right now. We are going to enable all students to have equity in their enrollment outcomes. And we're going to have to tackle some really difficult things, like, does our current resource allocation allow us to achieve that end? Should we be allocating resources in direct proportion with student representation? If 75% of our students identify as one race or ethnicity, should 75% of our enrollment resources go in areas that primarily serve that population? I would argue absolutely not. And that's what we need to talk about. How do we allocate resources to meet the needs? How do we prioritize the disparities in the outcomes over just representation rates? And what I think this comes down to, and the reason that we put this in the context of our hiring process, is how do we embed that thinking into our definition of who's most qualified to serve our institutions, our student communities, to be part of our system? How do we prioritize the knowledge, skills, and abilities? And on the slide, I use the shorthand KSAs, knowledge, skills, abilities. How do we prioritize that mindset in which we apply our technical knowledge and skills so that we can achieve these outcomes? And that's the focus of what, as we shift now and talk about data and hiring, we want to get towards. How can we see what we're doing in our hiring process now, the outcomes that we're getting, and then where we put our time and energy into changing it to get different outcomes? So jumping ahead, as we do this in HR, we think about workforce representation, availability, longitudinal hiring, and longitudinal phase and our selection criteria. I'm going to go beyond the technical terms that we use in research and HR. Jumping ahead to the next slide, let's translate this. What does it mean? Who are we? Who could we be? How did we get to where we are now? And where are the barriers that are preventing people from particular race, ethnicity, gender, ability, and other groups from getting through? When we identify where are the barriers, which is what Title V currently asks us to go to, how do we take a step beyond that and say, I know where it's happening, but now I want to know what specifically it is. And I'm going to offer a suggestion on how we can do that. So who we are, jumping to the next slide. This is our representation analysis. It's very simple. Total number of employees in particular classifications, and then the representation of each race and ethnicity. What you see represented on the slide are the definitions of race and ethnicity that are required by the federal government and by the state government. Virtually all of our colleges give give employees and applicants an opportunity to identify far more specific racial identities. We use these broader categories often because we need numbers, whole numbers, to get large enough to see patterns. And when we get really granular, and this is one of the challenges we have with intersectional identities as well, if the numbers get too small, it's really difficult to say anything conclusive about patterns. And so there is value in doing some aggregation, even though we lose some really important nuances. But so as we look at this, this just tells us who we are. We give this meaning. Would we define this as a diverse workforce or not? That's a conversation we have to have. And we're going to need some more data, I would say, to inform that decision. But jumping ahead to the next slide, as we get into that assigning of meaning, we need to do some quantitative and qualitative assessments and recognize that diverse is not a static measure. There's not one set of numbers that we can apply system-wide and every college can go, okay, we've achieved it, we are now diverse. We have to look within our specific operating context and ask some questions about the student experience first and foremost. In that last, or in the data below, you see among our administrators and our leadership, 3% of our administrators are Black. What do our students see when they see that? Or when many of them go through and never see someone who identifies as Black in a position of power and authority within our institution? How does that reinforce negative stereotypes that have marginalized many people who identify as Black within our community? We need to define that both in terms of what's possible with availability, which we'll talk about next, but also what provides the right educational environment for our students to unlearn those negative and false stereotypes and to learn how to participate in a diverse community and society successfully. When we look at this, we see that our classified professionals, holding on that slide for just a few more moments, our classified professionals have more racial diversity than our other groups. And initially you might look and say, that's great, right? But our classified professionals typically have a range of positions and industries that have historically had a lot of segregation and discrimination. And so it's no surprise that we look at some areas in our facilities departments, for example, and we find more people who identify as Hispanic and Latinx than we do in our administrative assistant or student services, perhaps. We need to look critically at what that's really telling us about the access to upward mobility, to higher levels of position, power, authority, economic mobility. And when we look at the percentage of people who are telling us, I'm not going to tell you my race or ethnicity, what does that say about our culture and people's comfortability with disclosing that? What do they think they are telling us when they tell us that? It's perfectly reasonable for someone who's experienced discrimination in their life to say, the only reason you're asking me my race is so that you can discriminate me. That's a logical conclusion if that's your lived experience. We need to do a lot of work to make sure that people understand that's not why we're asking this, quite the opposite. We value you, your lived experience, and we want to be institutionally explicit and intentional about making sure that we're providing you with meaningful inclusion and equitable outcomes. That's why we're asking. Okay, jumping ahead. So when we look at who we are, one way to define whether or not we've achieved a level of diversity that's appropriate is what could we be? And that's based on what is outside of our institution. Where could we be drawing people from? And I want to thank two of my HR colleagues, Wyman Fong from the Chabot Las Positas Community College District and recently retired Abe Ali from Mount SAC. When I came into the system and started meeting my peers and talking about my experience with data analysis in particular from my prior career, they immediately started asking, when are you going to help us figure out who our qualified candidates are? We do a lot of work around, comparing ourselves to our student population, our local community, but who's really out there that meets our minimum quals? We need that data, and they've been relentless over the last few years. And I finally made some significant progress on this, and we're putting together a tool that we'll be able to share out to the entire system to be able to say, these are the people that meet our educational requirements, and this is what the race and gender demographics of that group look like, so that we can compare ourselves and say, are we attracting the level of diversity in our applicant pools that's available out there? How should we change the way we recruit to do so? I think it is really important that we look at our student population, and that's part of that qualitative assessment of how well are we representing our community, and are we providing our students exposure to the kind of diversity that they need to see in order to learn how to function in a diverse society and to unlearn negative stereotypes and not come in and perpetuate barriers and attitudes and behaviors that have created exclusion and discrimination. So jumping ahead to the next slide, what does the analysis look like? We go to the data source, the US Census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, iPads where we can see information on college graduation rates and degree programs. We can look at our local community demographics. We can look at people that are working in particular industries and have a basis of knowledge, skill, and ability that would qualify for our positions. And we see the exact same kind of data. What percentage of that group identify within different race and gender categories? Jumping ahead to the next slide, we can take multiple sources and combine them together to create kind of a composite. If we said, you know, we're going to give 50% of our weight to the people that meet the minimum qualifications, we're going to give 20% weight to what our student population looks like. We can create a benchmark for comparison to help us define what diverse means for us. And with this, we can change, we can evolve how we do that process, how we assign those weights. So we're responsive to our immediate context, our strategic objectives, a changing demographic and environment that we're in. Most importantly, I want to highlight that this tells us what could be. It can't tell us what should be. That's what we have to engage in. We've got to sit down together with all of our stakeholders and decide through our collaborative process, defining what should be for us. The data give us reference points. This is what could be. Is that appropriate for us or not? That's the difficult conversation and hard work we have to engage in. So this is a tool to help us get there. Jumping ahead to the next slide, we can take that information then and we can compare it. So I look at the availability that we've decided represents what the way that we're going to find diverse right now, and we can compare it to what's currently happening in our workforce. And there are some statistical measures that we can do to decide, are we close? How close? Is it close enough? Is this an area that we should focus on? And that's what this helps us do, is allocate resources to say, we have not met the goals that we're setting for ourselves. Now let's devote more of our money, our time into recruitment in order to increase the number of qualified individuals that are identifying within these different communities and invite them in to become part of our system and really show them this is a place that they can come engage work that's going to make meaningful change towards racial justice, and they're going to transform the lives of our students who come through and are able to pursue their educational outcomes in a system that serves them better than any other system that they'll ever be part of. Jumping ahead to the next slide. So we go into the next step of understanding how we got to who we are now. So we saw our current workforce representation. That's happened through our hiring processes. And so let's analyze who gets through those. Let's look at the race, ethnicity, gender, identity of people in those pools, and then who gets hired. And what we're looking for is evidence of adverse impact. And adverse impact simply is the selection rate, the rate of success for one group based on race and gender is different than another group. And we can measure statistically how significant that is. When we look at long periods of time, if we did a 5-year analysis, we can see patterns and systemic concerns. This isn't just one moment in time. Over years of hiring opportunities, we see consistent results, positive or negative. If we look at shorter times, we can find isolated concerns. And so we might have a year where we do a lot of hiring in disciplines that historically have been primarily filled by members of a certain race or certain gender identity. We can also see emerging trends. And so if we look at the prior 4 years and this year looks different, we might be seeing a shift in our culture. We might be seeing a shift from a policy change that's happened. But this data helps us understand and give context we then use to carry forward the conversation. So jumping ahead to the next slide, what does the analysis look like? We take our applicant pool, the people that meet our minimum qualifications, say what does the racial and gender demographic look like? And I'll just point out quickly, for ease of this in a presentation, I've just used race. We would do the exact same thing with gender. We can do this with disability status, but I'm just using one example to for the sake of time. So we look at the representation in the pool, but then we look at the success rate of all of the people that applied that identified as Asian, what percentage got hired? And how does that compare with people that identified as Black or Hispanic or Latinx or Native American or white. We take the group that has that highest rate. In this example, it's our white applicants. 8% of the people who applied that identified as white got hired. We compare that to the success rate of the other groups, and that's that adverse impact. And so where you see in the third row, the 80% rule, which is a common measure used in this work, everywhere you see yes, we have adverse impact. The next line is a measure of how likely is that outcome, statistical probability. And that's really, for me, the point at which we say the outcomes are there's such a disparity here that this absolutely needs to be a priority for us. We need to understand why this is happening and figure out how to change these outcomes. So jumping ahead to the next slide, when we give this meaning, once again, we come back to the opportunity to start to rationalize the results. The kinds of things that we say or hear when we see adverse impact. Well, we always hire the most qualified applicant, and we just have a supply problem. We don't have enough qualified applicants from a particular race or ethnicity, which that might be true. But often when we go back and look at the data, we didn't select a lot of people that met those qualifications to move forward in our process. It wasn't a supply problem. It was what happened as we were given a chance to make subjective decisions about people. We have criteria that we've put in place that may not be directly correlated with successful job performance. It feels like it should be. If you have a higher level degree, you should be better capable of doing the job, but that doesn't always translate. I think we've all known plenty of people that had amazing credentials on paper, who when they showed up did not engage in their work in a way that was successful for us. And so we need to think about how we define most qualified, and should the preferred qualifications we have be part of that process. We can analyze that. And so we jump into the next section. We look at what are the barriers. So let's break that hiring process down into each step, where we tell one person, yes, you're moving forward, and we tell another person, thank you for applying, but you're no longer going to be considered. And that's what each phase of our process is. So it's when we screen for minimum qualifications. It's when we screen qualified applicants and invite them to an interview. It's when we interview and then move them to a second level. We do the second level, we decide to give a job offer. We can do the same analysis, identify adverse impact, and then start to figure out exactly why it's happening. And so the analysis looks almost identical. It's just more steps in the process. So jumping to the next slide, you'll see kind of an example of this. We can look at, in a longitudinal phase analysis, at the meets minimum qualification. What percentage of our candidates met the minimum qualifications? Then they went to the application screen. What percentage moved forward into the first level interview? Of that group, what percentage went forward to second level interviews? Moving on to the next slide, we do the exact same comparison of success rates to see if there was adverse impact. And once again, we face this moment of how do we make sense of that variance? What kind of justifications, explanations do we come up with? Or do we say this is a moment that we need to embrace change? And so we wrestle with some interesting questions like, why might one group be more likely to apply for a position when they don't meet minimum qualifications? I can tell you, as a white male growing up, I was told often that I can do whatever I want. If I put my mind to it and I work hard enough, I can succeed. That kind of mindset might lead me to apply for jobs that I don't meet the minimum qualifications for, feeling an irrational level of confidence and hoping that you're going to extend me the benefit of the doubt. Not everybody, most people don't get that kind of feedback and input growing up. And so they hear it very differently and are told, unless you're overqualified, you're not going to get fair consideration. That bleeds into the way we often do work in screening. We hold certain groups to a higher standard. They have to demonstrate more clearly they're qualified. So again, this provides us the basis for a lot of conversation about how we make sense of this, and then what are we going to do to get different outcomes. Jumping ahead to the next stage, we can then go into looking at where exactly, or what exactly the barriers are within each stage. And this is the part that's not required in Title V that we can go above and beyond to do. So in this example, we're looking at selection for the first level interview. And you see that white applicants, 37% moved from the application pool to the first level interview, but just under 20% of Hispanic applicants did. Jumping ahead to the next slide, we can start to interrogate what exactly were we looking at to make that decision. Was it legitimate job-related factors, or were there potentially discriminatory or bias factors in play? And so we look at the things that we've put on paper. There's a certain amount of experience that we want you to have, a certain level of education we want you to have. We set up worksheets with categories and we score candidates. We can look at our equivalency process, who got through, who didn't. Do we have mandatory interview policies? A lot of us in our CBAs have requirements for somebody who's a current employee applying for for example, a part-time faculty member applying for a contract position. If they've achieved certain performance standards, then they automatically get an interview. How does that affect the diversity of our pool? So jumping ahead, what does the analysis look like? We can quantify that information. So let's collect the data. Who met the minimum qualifications? Yes, no. And then how many years of experience did they have? And so we see here in this example, our white applicants, nearly 80% met the minimum qualification. 74% met the preferred qualification. On average, they had over 4 years of nursing education experience. On average, they had about 3 3/4 years of college level nursing education experience. But we invited applicants that had as few as 1 year of nursing education experience and no college level experience. Moving to the next slide, we see the same data collected for applicants that identified as Hispanic. And we see 56% met the minimum qualification. 25.5% met the preferred qualification. But on average, those we invited to the interview had nearly 6 years of nursing education experience, nearly 5 years of college level. The least amount that anybody had was 3.5 years of nursing education experience and 2.5 at the college level. Jumping to the next slide, we compare that data and see a difference in the way that we've applied this criteria. Our Hispanic applicants had to demonstrate a higher level of qualification in terms of their prior experience than were applied to the white applicants. This is a moment now to go back and really take a close look at why we're making decisions this way. How does this pattern of data emerge? Unless, without it being related directly to their race and ethnicity. In my experience, most often you're not going to see a very clear distinction that there weren't any Hispanic applicants that applied that only met the minimums, the way that we see with the white applicants. It's what we did in the screening process, the subjective judgments that we made about what we expected of a candidate and what we thought about their qualifications. We need to have difficult conversations around these facts. This is what the data is telling us. Jumping ahead to the next slide. So we can have a conversation now driven by data. We've identified who we are. We've identified what we could look like, but we've now did a deep dive into our actual process. And we can talk about the minimum qualifications that we have in place. Some are required in law. We can't change that. But some we add ourselves and on our classified administrator, it's almost entirely based on what we've added. Are those truly related to job performance? We can look at our preferred qualifications. What kind of barriers do those create? And how much do they really tell us about a candidate's ability to come in and succeed in our job? Is it something that feels like it should be correlated, or can we actually see evidence that if you meet that qualification, you do better when we hire you? Our screening criteria, are they predictors of performance? Why aren't we prioritizing the ability to serve diverse communities explicitly in our job ads, in our screening criteria? And in the next presentation coming up, we're going to talk about that in a lot more depth. So jumping ahead to the next slide and wrapping this presentation up, if we want to engage in anti-racist cultural change, we've got to decide that we are going to prioritize the success of our diverse student communities in our hiring decisions at every level in every single job. And so then we go into strategically, what kind of things do we need to challenge ourselves on? How do we add and embed a value for the understanding of our students' lived experience into our screening criteria, into our interview questions, so that we can assess how well our candidates understand what they need to do to come in and serve successfully? How do we ask in our application process for the information that lets us really measure that? I'm not going to see that from a list of jobs that someone's held in the past and where they went to school and what they got their degree in, right? I'm going to need to ask them different questions to get different information. How do we identify and then mitigate our biases? We all have biases and they influence our decisions. We need to be able to stop, reflect, identify, and then come up with strategies to prevent biases from driving our hiring decisions. We've got to start collecting the data. There is wonderful news. For the first time over the last several years, we've been doing a lot of advocacy to get ongoing money for EEO funding for districts into the state budget. It's in the January budget this year. If it survives through to the final budget in June, we will have a significant increase in investment in districts' ability to put resources into this work, which means that we're out of excuses. We need to allocate the resources and start collecting this data. We need to start doing the analyses, whether that's contracting with consultants to help us with it, or that's hiring new staff to come in with this expertise and do it. We can't just rationalize the outcomes when we see them. We've got to see that and say, this isn't good enough. And now let's engage in the hard work of figuring out how we're going to change what our structures are so that the behaviors that we engage in change. And we integrate DEIA into our definition of best qualified institutionally. Jumping into the last slide now. So coming back to where we started, doing the data analysis helps us see what is, but we decide what that means to us. And those are tough conversations. And a lot of people have chimed in the Q&A about the difficulties that we get in that. We can't shy away from the work. And so here's my call to action for our trustees and CEOs out there today. It's demanding that we get this data. Where is this data? Show us where we are, who we could be, and how we got to where we are. For our faculty colleagues, serving in academic senate, serving in our collective bargaining units, taking on overloads to meet our student needs, our part-time faculty, demanding to be part of this conversation. We want to see this data. We want to collaborate on giving this meaning. We want to work together to define a new strategic objective for our institution. We want to partner in coming up with new structures that change the way that we engage in this work. For our classified professionals, it's that same work, demanding a seat in that conversation, coming to the board and saying, we need to be more involved, going to your district leadership and saying, we need to be more involved in this. We are firsthand working with our students face-to-face every single day. We have a perspective that is critical. Our students, who have been tremendous partners in this, the Student Senate's participation in our DEI implementation work group has been phenomenal, and they've brought that message to every single meeting, carrying that forward into your local districts. We want to see this data. We want to know what you're doing about it. We want to see where we are prioritized in the way that you're allocating resources and taking action. If we engage in this work, if we're not willing to accept the status quo, if we engage with our skeptics and the people that say that this isn't a problem and work together, I think we can absolutely do it. So thank you so much for your time. We're coming up to right at 9:35. We have a 5-minute break. And then in the next section, we're going to talk about some specifics about what our hiring process might look like if we were to make transformational change. And a few of my colleagues are going to be joining me to talk about, from an HR perspective, how we can start to do this work, some of the successes we've had, some of the challenges. So thank you so much. I know I went very quickly through that. I'm going to go in and catch up on a lot of the Q&A. But with that, Vice Chancellor Alvarado, if you want to say anything before we go into our break, or if we can just go into our break now.
Let's go ahead and go to break. I'm sure folks can use it. That was amazing, Greg. That's the only thing I'll say. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the next session, which will be transformational change by way of equity-minded hiring principles and practices. Thank you again to Vice Chancellor of Human Resources, Greg Smith from San Diego Community College District, who will be joined by Eric Ramones, Associate Vice President, Gavilan Joint Community College District, Clint Doherty, Chief HR Officer, Imperial Valley College. Gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Tanya. All right. Thank you so much, Tanya. Before we get into the panel discussion, I'm going to start by sharing some specific recommendations that the DEI implementation work group has created around how we can do transformational change to our hiring processes. So jumping into the next slide, and thank you, Brian, for moving the presentation along for us. I want to start by just the context. Where does the imperative for change? And we need to be explicit about acknowledging our past. A lot of the way that we do hiring in America was developed in the early 1900s. And that was a time when discrimination was legal, discrimination was encouraged, and frankly, it was expected. If you hired a woman to be a CEO in 1920, you're probably going to be shunned out of your industry. We had job ads that said white man sought for a certain position, and that was not just legal, not just encouraged, but expected. And the way that we hired was built out of processes that were really established and codified during that time. And so what we see, the information we get in cover letters and resumes, CVs, reference letters, contain a lot of socioeconomic status markers, a lot of markers about access and inclusion into networks, and people's identity. We can infer a lot from names, from where someone went to school, from where they've worked, about what their race might be, their ethnicity might be, their gender, and other socioeconomic status markers. And we tend to give more benefit of the doubt to people that come from higher levels of status in terms of socioeconomic, who tend to be from race and gender identities that have predominantly been included in higher levels of professional work than those who have been excluded. And that becomes embedded into our system. And so the key things we have to wrestle with is that in those standard items, we don't get much information about how well someone is going to be able to facilitate the success of our diverse communities. And that's fundamentally who we are as a community college system. The majority of the students that we serve come from diverse communities, and from communities that have not been given the same kind of access, who've not been given the same kind of resources historically, and have experienced that marginalization. How do we change that if we're not hiring people that are focused on using their knowledge, skills, and ability to participate in changing that? And we think about the moment that we're hiring for, right? As we look at technical knowledge, skills, and abilities, yes, if we're hiring a faculty member, the ability to create a syllabus that meets all of our requirements, to create a course that fits within our accreditation standards is essential. Doing that in a way that facilitates successful instruction from students from a diverse set of cultural backgrounds is essential. It's both of those working together. That's the moment that we're hiring for, I would argue. So jumping ahead to the next slide, it starts with the way that we market ourselves. And I've been in a lot of conversations around this, talking about the fact that I don't think that we leverage our power as a system to attract people that are already focused on doing their work in this way. We are very different than a lot of higher education systems that have very strict barriers to students getting in. You have to go through a lot of hoops to prove you're worthy and are going to reflect well in the institution. We say, as Chancellor Oakley likes to say, we admit the top 100% of students who apply. But more importantly, that if other institutional structures have failed you, this is where you can come and succeed. This is where you can transform your life, the outcomes that you experience, your family experiences, our community experiences. That's a powerful mission to be part of. And people that are dedicated to that kind of work, that are passionate for that kind of work, should know that this is where you can come and do that. And so if we move more, especially on the HR side, for my HR colleagues, to doing employment marketing through videos, instead of just text. Our websites are really good at telling people how to apply for a job. If they already know they want to work here and they know what job they want to apply for. But if somebody's casually looking, how do they see who we are, what we're about, and what they would experience if they came and worked here? So communicating our visions and values in a way that shows very clear images, the dialogue, the music, all of the cues that can happen through a video that don't happen in text on a web page, can show diverse job seekers your lived experience is part of what is going to make you highly qualified to work here. The passion that you bring for transforming outcomes for your community is part of what's going to make you highly qualified to work here. And I think this has mutually beneficial objectives for us, that people that are already thinking, I want to work in that context, in that environment, I want to use all of the knowledge, skills, and experience I've accumulated to advance that kind of work, I have found the right place to come. For those who say that's not really important and I don't care about it, you're not going to like working here because this is what we're focused on. So there are plenty of other places that you want to go apply, but it's probably not going to be here if you're not aligned with this mission. And that's a really important part of what we should be marketing. Jumping ahead, getting into the actual mechanics of our application process. So the conventional application materials, right? We see someone's name, we see where they've worked, what schools they attended. We see examples of their writing, both in how they tell us about their prior employment and in their cover letter and other materials. We can see a lot about social class, what kind of language they use. Do they follow the conventions that we've been taught, or do they not? We can see kind of geographically where they're from. We know something about racial and ethnic makeup of different communities geographically, a lot of indicators there. As we read that, we might not be explicitly thinking, oh, how do I figure out what this person's race is? But all of those cues are working in our mind, and we're making those correlations. There's a lot of what I would say are unsubstantiated assumptions about just prior experience. If I know you've been on a job for 5 years, I assume you must have a certain level of proficiency at it, but I don't get a real objective measure of that. I'm just making an assumption. And wouldn't it be better if we had information that told us how well you did your job, or at least how you went about it, so that I can assess how well that's going to translate into our context? I don't just want to know that you did a job. I want to know how you did the job, what you brought to it. But we don't ask for that explicitly. And that's not part of kind of the conventional way that people write resumes or fill out applications. These materials systematize positive and negative stereotypes. And so it cuts in both directions. And just give one kind of generic example. If we're hiring for an early childhood education instructor and I apply for that job, one of the stereotypes that I might have to overcome is, why does a middle-aged white male want to spend all this time around kids? If a woman applies for that job, people might immediately think, well, women are better caretakers, more compassionate. This is a career field that they want to be in. So there's going to be a positive assessment there, going in the opposite of what we would see if it was an administrative level position, if we're hiring for a dean or a VPI, where we might say, well, men have historically held leadership positions. They're more naturally inclined to do that well. And a woman's going to have to prove herself against those negative stereotypes. We allow those to become part of our assessment when we have all of this information that gives cues about that isn't really helping us make objective decisions about how well they're going to engage in the work we need them to in the context that we do. And that context, I think, is critical, that we're not just asking for somebody that understands the fundamentals of math to come teach math. We're asking for somebody that understands math and those fundamentals to teach people from a diverse set of racial backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, ability backgrounds, in a way that's going to facilitate their success. The application of the knowledge, skills, and abilities is just as important as the knowledge itself. Jumping ahead to the next slide. So how do we change this? And so what we've come up with is a set of recommendations that say, start by bringing together a committee of diverse stakeholders and rethinking our rules around who serves on committees. We often put a lot of people that are experts in the technical competency of the work, discipline experts, or if we're not talking about a faculty position, people that are doing similar work or related work, who can say, yes, they understand the technical competence, but do we carve out explicit space for people that are assessing how well that person's going to work within a diverse environment? The way that they approach their work, is that going to contribute to our values around accessibility, inclusion, equity, and outcomes? Or are they going to do it in a way that perpetuates barriers to that? Are they going to treat people differently based on their identity and not give people the same level of service? Do they understand the lived experience of the communities we serve so that they're designing to eliminate barriers before they ever happen? And I think that's a really essential and critical part of this. If we're thinking strategically, we're thinking ahead, we're identifying the barriers before we ever put them in place and designing to never have them there. We need people that understand how to do that. And I would argue that's not something that in the hiring process, we want to be thinking, well, we'll teach you that after you get here. We'll hire you because you have this basic technical knowledge, and then we'll teach you how to do it in this context. I would say we make that context essential. If you don't have it, we're not willing to teach it to you. We have enough people out there that understand that context. We're going to prioritize hiring them. The committee then defines what are the attributes and behaviors that it takes to do their job successfully within this diverse context that we're talking about, and drafts a set of questions to get exactly at those behaviors and attributes, asking candidates to tell us specifically about how you have done things in this specific context and the positive outcomes that you've delivered. That becomes our initial application. And so whether it's 8 questions, 12 questions, 15 questions, we are looking at a set of focused responses on the things that we've decided are so important that if an applicant can't do these well, we shouldn't hire them. We're not looking at just where you went to school and saying, well, school A has got a better reputation than school B, so that must mean that you're more qualified and I should give you a little bit more benefit of the doubt. You're going to get the interview and the other person's not. It's how well they've explained how they're going to do the job in the actual contest we work within. we can now solve the problem for those of you that were in the last session that Trustee Calhoun gave me of why do we still have the personally identifiable information in this? If this is the way that people apply, it's going to be very easy for us to systematically in HR remove that personally identifiable information. And committees are just going to see candidate A and here's their answers. Now, a candidate may have decided within the answer to a question to include information that gives us those cues. But we've done our part in taking out the conventional indicators that are there. Jumping into the next slide. So we get this information. We now need to think about the interview process and the way that we score and rate this, and fundamentally make it part of the way that we score, valuing the DEIA context. And so I would argue that behavioral interview questions are the best way to get rid of biases in our interview and really narrow in on how a candidate's going to engage in the work, because we give them a very specific context, and I'll get into exactly what that looks like. When we look at our scoring rubrics at the application screening and the interviewing stage, we came up with a recommendation around how to embed DEIA into the scoring matrix Excel, so that somebody who not only has the knowledge, skills, and abilities that can do it well in a DEIA context will always score higher than someone that just has the baseline knowledge, skills, and abilities. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like. And so what we do is we redefine best qualified to be explicitly and inextricably linked to our operating context, which is serving our diverse communities successfully, creating equitable outcomes in an inclusive and accessible way. Jumping over to the next slide. So here's an example of what that open-ended application question might look like. I'm not going to read through all of it, but you start with, you have to understand the technical competence that goes in with creating math curriculum in order to answer this question. So we get at the technical knowledge, skill, and ability, but we add the context to it. How have you diversified that curriculum to ensure that students from a wide range of cultural communities are represented? I would argue it's very difficult to make up an answer on the fly to this. You've either done it and you can tell us what you did and we can assess how well you're going to do it, or you haven't done it. And if you try to just make up something on this that isn't true, it's not going to come across as genuine. I think we'll be able to spot that a majority of the time. A few people might be able to slip through, but we're going to catch them in the interview. But this is the kind of thing we might see where we structure the answer for them, where they tell us the positive outcome, they tell us how they did it and how that's going to translate if they're hired into our job. Isn't this much more substantive information for us to assess about whether or not they're going to succeed if we hire them than just tell me that you've been a math teacher for how long and at which institutions? Isn't this much more substantive for us? Jumping ahead to the next slide. So what does a behavioral interview question entail? So the reason that I think these are so powerful is because it asks people to draw on their past performance. And the best way to predict what somebody's going to do tomorrow is to look at what they did yesterday. It forces people to respond with behaviors instead of philosophies. I've been in a lot of interviews where people said really amazing things about their passion for something, but never told us what they're actually going to do. And that's what really matters most to me. The philosophy is nice, but I need to know what you're going to do and whether or not that's going to be successful. And we can rewrite all of these questions to embed an equity-minded performance with very rare exception. A behavioral interview question can very easily be phrased in that context. It gives us a way to eliminate the good interviewee bias, because on the fly, you're not going to be able to make up a good answer. You either have past experience or you don't. And so we get rid of somebody who can speak eloquently in an interview scoring higher just because we were impressed with their professional presentation if we score on the substance. Next slide. So here's the formula. We start with the context, that's the lead in. We then ask just a generic open-ended beginning, and then we get to the specific desired behavior within that context. So an example, many of our students are first-generation college students. For those of us who know what that means, that context has a very specific connotation about who we're serving and what kind of things we need to do to serve them well. But even if you don't know what first-generation college student means, you can still answer this question when we get to the back half of it. Please describe a time you helped someone from a different cultural background understand a new process and achieve their desired outcome. So someone might say, I don't know what a first-generation college student is, but at my prior job doing whatever, here's how I did that. I worked with people from diverse backgrounds in this context and helped them achieve success. That's what it takes to serve a first generation college student well, right? They come without the familial and necessarily social support and network to help them navigate the complexities of our process. So they need us to be there to be able to facilitate that and not just say, you need to go down the hall around the corner to the financial aid line and fill out 3 forms there, but to really help them understand the process and how to succeed. And you can see there in the desired behavior, we've embedded the DEIA element into this. You could take that out of there and say, just tell us about how you've helped someone understand a new process and achieve their desired outcome. But by injecting that in, we get both. Do you understand how to help people succeed who don't know coming in the language, the acronyms, the system? But can you do that specifically when they come from a very different background than you do? Can you overcome barriers, stereotypes, negative expectations? Next slide. So the scoring rubric, how do we fundamentally change the way we score and who scores highest? We came up with an example where the first 3 points, or the first 2, I guess, 0, 1, and 2, are based primarily on the knowledge, skill, and ability. When you answered the questions, when you answered the application prompts, you showed that you have some related experience and preparation, and you can achieve successful outcomes. There's the knowledge, skill, ability section of it. If you want to get the 3rd point and the 4th point, though, the 3rd point, you've got to be able to tell me how you have achieved successful DEIA-related outcomes within your specific job. If you want to get the 4th point, you've got to show that you not only influence those successful outcomes within your individual role, but more broadly institutionally. Have you engaged and participated in a way that has moved the entire institution forward? And so this way, somebody comes in and they're the world's preeminent expert in physics, they can get 2 points. But if they're unwilling to engage with students who identify as Black, who identify as queer, who don't share their cultural background in a way that facilitates their success, they're never getting beyond 2 points. And they're never going to be the most qualified candidate. And isn't that true for our context? They're not the most qualified candidate because they're not going to serve the diversity of our students effectively. So we embed this fundamentally into how we score. Going into the next slide. And so in summary, the process that we are recommending gives us the ability to do neutral screening. We remove the personally identifiable information. We focus our application on functional information about performance framed in a DEIA context. By getting rid of those superficial indicators, we eliminate a lot of the opportunity for intentional and unintentional bias. Not all of the opportunity, but a lot of it goes away. We reframe how we define who's best qualified, specifically in the context we operate in. And we use questions and a scoring format that builds DEIA into the structure itself. Our hiring process becomes focused in the context of DEIA, not as a second minimum qualification or a lesser minimum qualification, but as inexplicitly linked with technical knowledge, skills, and abilities. So with that context, I want to welcome 2 of my colleagues, Dr. Eric Ramones, Clint Doherty. I'm going to give them both a chance to introduce themselves, their background in the system, and specifically some successes that you've had in this area over the course of your time in the system. So Dr. Ramones, let's go over to you first.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you everyone for having me here. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor at West Valley Mission Community College District. And basically just to say that the anti-racism and diversity work that we are all doing collectively is such the highest priority to me in terms of what we can really do for our students. And that is really what centers and motivates why we're doing DEIA work. It's the students that we serve very specifically, but it's also on a broader sense, the society and the world that we're preparing them for. We know, as mentioned before, a lot of structures and systems have been created historically with racism, sexism, and we know that by looking at these systems, in order to challenge them, you have to really go deep into why, asking the questions that Greg had mentioned about why is this happening, what can we do better, and what is the way that we can change the outcome of our students in our sphere of influence, specifically our organization. So, there's a lot of work that is done in terms of the hiring process. I know we're going to get more into details of what's going to happen, but I'll just stop there and allow Clint to introduce himself right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I'm not quite as articulate as you and Greg, but good morning, everyone. And I'm glad to be part of this and share with you whatever I can share. I'm the Chief Human Resource Officer at Imperial Community College District. And I've been in the community college system, HR, since 2008. I'm career Navy before that. I guess the small piece that I will offer that I've been dealing with most of the time I've been in the system is being at rural, smaller districts. It's kind of been a challenge, I guess, in combating the small town rural mentality of it's often referred to as nepotism or hookups or whatever labels it's been given, but to break through those barriers and ensure our recruitment practices are reach out to all and not just relatives, family members, and friends. And so that's the kind of the thing I've been dealing with a lot. Obviously, we want to have the diversity and the equity minded folks, workforce, and a lot, I can only really echo a lot of what Greg initially said here about taking a real hard look at our recruitment practices and removing those barriers, because frankly, handling it from the recruitment side, I feel like the application pools are getting, at least in a small town rural area, it's really hard to get applicants because the going in perception is we're going to hook up family and friends. And how does that fit into diversity and equity? Well, I would just say Imperial County or the population that our community college serves is over 95% Hispanic. And so it's really difficult. And the barriers are across the board, not to pick on anybody or anyone. It's dealing with the board who kind of have a mentality of only hiring local, and serving the community. And so there's deconflicting, I guess, or all that, and having recruitment practices where anybody of any race, ethnicity, gender feels comfortable applying for IBC, knowing that they have a fair shot of employment with our district. And so those are kind of the challenges that I'm being faced with. So with that, I'll pass it back to Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. It's interesting. All three of us have experience in single college districts that are more rural or remote, and in multi-college districts that are larger, more urban. So, Eric, going through your experience, Clint raised some very especially in the smaller communities, those local networks become more entrenched, and it is more difficult to recontextualize the importance of this work within that framework. Why should we, given that we have a close-knit, tight local community, we're in a smaller area, why should this be important to us? Is there anything that you've been able to do over the course of your career that's been successful in giving that context that you could point to?
Yeah, I think yeah, that it is definitely a difference, and oftentimes the smaller colleges have to compete against the larger districts for talent. And I know that there's been, in terms of housing and all of the inequities related to that, a lot of housing are more developed in rural areas now. So, if you look at that formula, you're thinking, wow, now we have people who are, moving to our community, in our small community, small rural community, that can actually, that came from the larger cities and the larger metropolitan areas, that can really fill our talent. But how come they're not coming to our organization? I'm sure if you just tell them that instead of commuting to work for an hour or two, then working locally is something definitely very much appealing to them, especially for work-life balance. But I think it starts with, as you mentioned before, Greg, centering the entire recruitment process and hiring materials and everything that you have about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, right? If it is in one paragraph, or if it's a question or two that is asked during the assessment process, then that is where we know that is just one small aspect, and it begs the question, is it truly that important to this district, to this small district? I think all of the questions and scenarios could have an element, arguably, of DEIA within them, and also including the, as you just shared, a lot of the scoring and the weighting of the scores that we have. So I think in general, that's really the biggest challenge, but also the biggest piece that people could see that could make a world of difference, is looking at everything that throughout the entire hiring process, if it spells to the importance of and significance of DEIA work.
Yeah, I'd add from my experience that I've gotten the most positive response when we've reframed this conversation around our students specifically, because I think that virtually everybody who comes to work in our system is committed to the idea that we want to serve our students successfully. And when we talked about, as I worked in an area that was predominantly white, 85 to 90% up in Northern California and some of those counties, we talked about what happens for that student who comes through high school, elementary school, high school, into our community college, does well, and then they go to Sacramento or the Bay Area to go to university. The day that they step foot, in Oakland, their whole entire world has just changed. We need to be more diverse than our local community to prepare our students to go and succeed in more diverse environments, because not everybody's just going to stay in this community. And as you just pointed out, Eric, the demographics are changing, right? People are moving out into more rural areas, housing and living costs being one big factor driving that change. But as we become a more diverse local community, are we preparing students for the context they're going to work and live in 10 years from now? And what do we need to expose them to? And I found that a lot of people reframed it in a way that made a lot of sense immediately. Like, yeah, that is important. And a lot of people could think back in their own educational journey and going into different institutions and seeing different social contexts, and a lot of us struggled initially with, I've never been in an environment like this. How do I succeed? How do I engage successfully with the people around me? And so I think if we can recenter that conversation around effectively serving our students and preparing them for the next stage of their life, a lot of people can see and buy into that. And it gets beyond some of the initial feeling of, this is a problem that happens somewhere else. LA needs to deal with this because look how diverse that city is, but that's not us at Imperial Valley. We are in a very different context, and we're all part of kind of a shared community around that.
And to that point, Greg, just something that you mentioned, it also is kind of triggered really something very critical in a conversation that I had at a small district and one that I had at a larger district, is that the participation of students on the hiring panel. I am a staunch proponent of that. And I know there's all kinds of commentary. Well, they're busy and it's a long process. And, you know, we hardly can get a student on the panel or the hiring committee. I think we need to double down on students, because if it's centered around students, why are we only having 1 or 2 students on that hiring panel, hiring committee? I know that there's so many strict rules, and a lot of it, you know, some of it is also HR, you know, rules that we've created that we need to really question. Is okay, so the student is not able to attend one aspect of it. Okay, they're automatically out of the process. Can we think about how we could include students in other ways, in other phases through the hiring process, so that their voice is heard and that they're really reflecting the diversity and it's really student-centered? I think that's where we really need to push ourselves as HR colleagues is, are we really putting students at the center if we only have 1 student at the hiring committee and potentially, you know, 1 vote in the process?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Eric. I just posted in the chat for everybody to see a link to where in the ACRO EEO website, we've posted recommendations that we finalized through the DEI implementation work group. One of the very first ones we tackled was that topic right there. How do we increase student participation? And I credit the trustees and the student senate who collectively came together, invited us as ACRO into this conversation and said, you know, you're HR, you're where so many of these policies live. How do we do this? And what you just said was one of the innovations that we thought about, was that instead of having only participants who can sit in on every single meeting and step of the process, which is a major time commitment, not possible for school schedules, for work schedules, how can we break this up into smaller chunks of participation where a student can come in, sit in on a portion of it, give the committee their perspective, what they heard, what was important to them, and the committee now can embed that into their decision-making and their deliberation. And just having that can be transformative in the decisions that get made, because suddenly it's been too long since I was a community college student. I don't remember everything that I went through and what was important to me in that moment. I need to hear it right now. And the context has changed. You know, what it was in 1995, 96, when I was at Cerro Coso in the current community college district, that's not today. So hearing that, I think, is critical. And anybody interested in ways to do that, please go check out that link. So I want to shift focus a little bit, and we'll start with you on this one, Clint. So I presented, you know, some ideas about some pretty big transformations, fundamental changes in how our application process would look. And many people have asked in the Q&A about the structures that are in place that we have to go through in order to implement that kind of change. Some of this is collective bargaining related. All of it is going to have to go through participatory governance, and we need buy-in from a lot of different people. So Clint, over the course of your experience, how can we engage in those processes successfully? You know, as we as HR professionals, for our attendees who are interested faculty members, administrators, trustees, how do we start that process, and what might we do to be more successful in working through those collaborative, participatory, and bargaining processes?
Yeah, thank you, Greg. You know, I think we all are somewhat aware of the challenges of that when you're trying to incorporate changes, regardless if it's, you know, recruitment or anything else, that you have to start somewhere. And my experience is I try and lay groundwork informally. Like, I have conversations with key folks, such as, you know, union leadership, academic senate president, my fellow cabinet members, administrators, I might have even discussions with faculty and staff that would require which I would need as fellow advocates to get things going. Usually, if you use an approach of laying out an idea or a need for change, like unilaterally, top down, it usually doesn't go too well. It takes a real long time. And you get way more pushback if you had not, contrary to going out and networking, kind of laying the groundwork and the rationale and the need for the change and how the change will benefit everyone, the district, not only the district, the students, but everyone. And so I think it's just through the I'll call it informal channels, for lack of a better word, but laying that, and then almost get like you my approach has always been to try and make it to transfer it to someone else to lead it for me in a lot of situations. In other words, if you got to get something through the faculty and through academic senate, what I've done in the past, I've called the academic senate president and I said, hey, look, here's the situation, here's a challenge that I might even ask them without even telling them what I'm thinking about. Ask them how they think an approach would be to address the change or solution to a problem, and kind of get it to be their idea instead of yours, right? And so then you have basically a strong advocate. The same approach with union leadership. Like way before I start negotiations, I have a monthly meeting with the union leadership, and a lot of times it's just chatting, because of our communications, we're able to just kind of resolve a whole lot of things informally, and just having a good relationship with those people, and they help you get buy-in to the stuff. And then negotiations, it's not always rosy, we know that, but like negotiations becomes a little bit less adversarial, and let's find a solution together. It's also recognizing or having a little bit of humility yourself that maybe you don't have the best solution or the best idea. And I think people really appreciate someone, a leader, an advocate for change, if they're part of the process, if they're included in the discussions, or I might even call them pre-discussions, right? And lay some of that groundwork. So that's how I navigate that with the board of trustees. It's a little bit more complicated, but the way I approach that is I communicate with the president superintendent quite a bit, and when the superintendent president has meetings with board members, then maybe some of those things can be conveyed, the rationale. I think that anytime you can use data instead of being anecdotal really helps as well. Because the data in some ways quiets the emotional response, especially for those that are pushing back. If you can show data, and one thing that I greatly appreciate is the CHRO network, where we can share with each other. It's like, okay, we have this challenge. So one thing I think it's really important to realize is you're not alone. Like if you have a challenge or problem to affect change, whatever change that is, I'm sure there's somebody else out there, a counterpart that is experiencing that or has dealt with that. So I think using all your resources and getting different ideas of how to approach something. Obviously, you have to be in sync with your own district culture and ways of doing things, but those are kind of the approaches and that I use, and the experiences I've had have been, I feel, pretty successful. And where have being open-minded and open to other solutions is important too. So.
Thank you, Clint. Eric, same question. From your experiences, how can we engage in that, start these difficult conversations, work through these processes successfully?
I think the critical word that you said, Greg, is difficult, and it is uncomfortable when you're talking about racism, period, or just sexism or any type of inequity in our history. And so I think there has to be a grounding and leveling discussion that happens ideally before the hiring committee meets, right? So oftentimes, and I think a lot of us in many districts do an orientation, which we have typically the CEO, the chancellor, or the president come in and give a message that this is what I'd like, this is the vision. And part of that vision I've seen done effectively from my experience is centered around DEIA. And that's usually the first message that's given is, we need to serve our students. We need to have that. So I know that this is probably unpopular, but we do need to take time to have those difficult conversations. We can't simply just have the first meeting or the first orientation the first time someone is challenged with anti-racist structures, right? So I think there's a lot of leveling and grounding that has to happen. As you mentioned before, Greg, unconscious bias or implicit bias trainings that happen before, and then maybe a facilitated dialogue with the hiring committees or even in larger groups to basically prepare for the hiring season. So maybe not just wait till that hiring committee is formed, but have a list of people that have identified as people that want to be part of the process, get them trained through the normal unconscious bias and the EEO regulations, but then have a really spirited, intentional conversation that's facilitated, centered around racism. I think that's the piece that really will ground them into, even before getting orientated into the process, even before looking at one applicant, they have that in their mind, and then give them a tool, a rating tool, a rubric, a criteria-based document that can really accentuate and emphasize the weight carried around DEIA.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So critical. And I'll share from my experience, sometimes success, the origins are failure. And Clint, you used the word humility. I think that's critical in this. And when I was at Shasta College, heard from a loud group of people that weren't as large as I thought, with a lot of feedback around the trainings that went into serving on a hiring committee. And it felt, given who I was hearing from, like this, everybody agrees, this needs to be changed fundamentally. And so I pressed forward with that change. And then found out very quickly there was a very large silent majority who did not agree with what I had just done. And so I had to have the humility to say I was wrong. I did this the wrong way. And to show up at meetings with the Senate, with the unions, and say, I did this incorrectly. And I'm here to acknowledge, accept, and now let's work on doing this right. And I think that's a powerful moment for us in positions to influence change, to come forward and do what you said, Clint, of saying, I don't have the answer. I can help define this problem. I know it's a problem. It's an important problem. I'm not capable of solving it alone. And it's our collaboration. And then the last thing I would add is, and I said this earlier, engaging skeptics, I think is really important. And I prefer to do it early. I think there's a few things that of value that come from that. One is that there are a lot of features of what we've done in the past that have been successful and are good. And we don't want to lose that. And they often are the voice that are going to help us retain what is working. But we're also going to identify the barriers to successful culture change, to structural change, to behavioral change early on, right away, up front. And if we can convince skeptics to join us, they can become our most powerful allies. When people know that a person who was fundamentally opposed to something is now saying, no, I've gone through some critical thinking on this, and I believe we need to do this, it makes people that were kind of in the middle that haven't examined it go, well, if you convince that person that this needs to be done, it must be important, it must be worth our time. And that can be hugely powerful. So I agree with everything that you both shared on that. With our last 10 minutes here, I want to kind of shift the focus towards the future and ask, just, starting with you, Eric, as you look at the next year, 2 years, 3 years, we're emerging from a pandemic. We've learned a lot of lessons about who we can be as organizations that we've been forced into. We're more flexible, we're more persistent, we're more resilient than we might have even known. As we come out of this moment, how do we, what are your priorities? What are you going to be working on to evolve your institution to be a more DEI focused organization?
Yes. So I think one important piece of that is moving forward, looking at the future, right? Looking at the present and the future. I think just by human nature, we dwell so much on the past, what we did or how the system has been, or repeating the same hiring practices that we've done for years and years and decades. I think the one thing that I started to do in my current institution is to have EEO monitors that are not just HR professionals. These are people that are outside, go through a training for EEO monitors or diversity champions, and try to push for one of the EEO monitors or diversity champions to be in every hiring process. I know that's a very arduous task, especially large districts. It's virtually impossible to have, an EEO person that is well trained, not in addition to, the person who's ensuring that, fairness and discrimination doesn't occur. I think having people that are outside of the HR department, really garnering support from people outside, both faculty, classified, and other administrators that could serve that role. I think traditionally in most districts, that role is served by EEO professionals, and it doesn't have to be. It could be spread to people who are very much into that moving forward. And then the other thing moving forward, aside from having EEO monitors at every hiring process, I think also what we talked about earlier is really having that foundational building that occurs. Oftentimes it feels like I checked the box, I did the EEO training, I did the Title V, I did all of those things, and I did my unconscious bias, and then there's no substantive dialogue until it comes up in a very tense conversation of why is this person seeming to be biased towards this one candidate and the other. And I think that's where the difficulty is. If we normalize the conversation of racism, anti-racism is going to be more it'll be more tangible for us if we normalize that conversation. And I do want to conclude though with saying something that really kind of motivated me also for continuing this, and it speaks to why we need to, look into the future and not, continue to recur what has historically been racist or sexist. I was working at the fire department, and I know that in the fire department, police departments, and military, typically, their focus is we need more women in the service. And so when we were having this discussion, preparing for our Fire Recruit Academy before it goes out, the conversation centered around me asking, why are women not making our process? Well, it's really because of that physical examination, that physical test. They failed the physical agility test. And so when that was mentioned, and other commentary that was grounded in opinion, not fact, but men are stronger and all of this, it's scientifically proven, all of those things, I said to them, let's think about how many times any firefighter, male or female, needs to utilize physical strength and at what degree. So I shared the data that 85, 86% are medical related responses, which means traumas, car accidents, things like that. So wouldn't a better indicator or a required job qualification be the ability to show empathy, the ability to de-escalate a situation, the ability to have conflict resolution techniques? That all of that does not involve physical strength. And I'm not downgrading the need for physical strength for the fire service. Absolutely, you need it. But how much is it weighted? And the conversation then led to many of the firefighters saying, we don't want to reduce, or we don't want to lower our standards. I said, if the standard is set with knowing that medical calls are the highest calls for this particular department, and generally overall in fire departments, it is typically medical, then let's have another conversation about why do we need to continue with this physical agility test as it stands and how we've done it for years. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That it can be so difficult to recognize that the way that I've bought into doing things is part of the problem. And that requires some really critical self-evaluation. That takes a lot to build up the capacity to do that. And your example is an excellent one of how we scrutinize ourselves, in effect. Why are we requiring things the way that we are? And that is really important work in that. So Clint, same kind of question, as you look forward to the future, where our system, our institutions are headed, what do you think our priorities over the next 1, 2, and 3 years should be in this work?
Well, I think we continue with our efforts to break down the barriers to and the biases, hidden or otherwise, that prevent us from hiring the right people. I think, as it's been mentioned earlier, it's not necessarily the most qualified or the where you went to school or those type of things, but it's I just feel like there's so many lost opportunities for us to get the best people for the job that we're asking them to do. And I think so whatever we can do in the future to remove those barriers, to address the biases that our hiring committees have, I think we push forward with that. I think we also need to frequently reflect on our policies and procedures to see if they really make sense. I mean, Eric touched on something that's very close to me, because I was in the Navy when they opened up the entire service to women serving on ships. And it was quite an ordeal to go through. But a lot of the assumptions that women were not fit or strong enough to do certain jobs in the Navy was quickly disproved. So it's about the you know, to some degree, the courage to step forward. I know a mentality that we all run across is, you know, it kind of goes along with the resistance to change is, you know, if it's not broke, why fix it? And I think with the people that think in that concept, we need to show them that, well, it is kind of broken. So we do need to fix it, you know. And for those that are under Deming philosophy of management, you know, continuous improvement, always not being content with the status quo, and always moving forward and improving our processes and our procedures to remove the things that prevent us from hiring the best people. The best people. I don't know how else to put it. So.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. And just to close this section off, I want to thank you both for your time this morning, sharing your experiences, your perceptions into this conversation. And I'll kind of wrap it up by saying, I think what you both just talked about here, the critical self-reflection as institutions is so important in this. And that deficit perspective and looking at someone and saying, well, it's what you brought that's the problem, is the mindset that we have to change. That's the major culture change. That we're going to look at, wait, what are we doing that's creating the problem for you? That becomes the change in our thinking, and not assigning that outward, but looking inward self-reflectively. Hard work. It doesn't feel good sometimes as you engage in that, to go, well, I've been perpetuating something negative and was blind to it. I didn't see it happening. How do I change that? But once we get over that moment, transformation can absolutely happen. So Clint, Eric, thank you so much. Everybody who joined us, thank you for tuning in. We have another 5-minute break before we head into the breakouts, and I'll turn it over to Tanya now.
Thank you so much, Greg. We want to thank everyone that has presented thus far. The conversations have been informative, inspiring, and certainly empowering. At this time, we'll transition into our breakout sessions, but we'll have a 5-minute break. So when we transition into our breakout sessions, we'll have the opportunity to discuss and deliberate some of these issues that have surfaced. The sessions have been organized by role, but please feel free to join the session most closely aligned with your interests. Breakout sessions, as you'll see in the chat, have been organized around faculty, classified professionals, trustees, executives, middle leaders, and HR professionals. Please join those links and check in. The session will begin at 10:45. Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, I'm not sure where I can't start my video, but we are in the last hour of the proceeding. I want to thank all of you who were able to join us in the breakout sessions. I'm sure the conversations were fruitful, inspiring, and empowering. So before we get started, I want to ask the facilitators, I'll give them a second to get ready, because this is going to be the report back session. So we have faculty, trustees, executives, middle leaders, HR professionals, and classified professionals that will be in the report back. So let's begin with our esteemed leader, Nan Gomez Heitzberg, to report back from the Board of Trustees.
Not sure about esteemed, but definitely ready and willing to report. Well, I had the advantage of sitting in a space, virtual space, with people who have really exemplified leadership with trustees. Trustee Linda Waugh from Pasadena College, Ken Brown from El Camino, Marissa Perez from Cerritos, and Adrian Gray from Mission West Valley. All of those people have been active and engaged in DEIA from the onset. And all of them have played an important role in their own colleges, but also on the state level. So I think what they had to share and what we're going to share with you today really speaks to the very best of combining experience with expertise and hopefully some wisdom to share today. So probably very similar to your conversations. One of the key threads in all of our conversation was conviction, how critical it is for trustees to have the conviction and the belief in DEI and that it is the most important thing for us to focus on because it focuses on student success and the success of our employees. Having the courage of your convictions or your commitment, because it is not an easy task. There are times when trustees and boards are faced with apathy, resistance. I just have to say college communities as a whole have no problem with speaking up and sharing their opinions about what's happening on a board. And to have the persistence and tenacity to hang in there regardless. I'm going to share one very specific example of having tenacity. Some of you look at disaggregated data and as though that's commonplace. I'll tell you that about 15 years, there were folks that were working on getting that information down to the college level, to the trustee level. Expanded disaggregation so that we can look at not just Asians, but Pacific Islanders and all the variations of Asian identity. That has taken at least 7 years. And in the last 2, it's been available in our districts so that we can ask for that information. That was Linda Waugh. Along with others. She took up the mantle 7 years ago and worked with colleagues across the system to get that taken care of. Never wavering from the idea that this was important for us to have in order to really understand our students and to build better systems so that they can be successful. The other point, and it seems like a long time ago that Chancellor Oakley's call to action went out for all of us after the murder of George Floyd. And that became a catalyst for many boards to look at what was happening on their campus, to take another look at their students, to take a look at policies and practices and processes. That we don't want that kind of experience to be what motivates us to carry on and to have renewed energy in looking at our institutions and removing barriers to really having anti-racism institutions that where we all can thrive. There is sometimes a sense of inertia or fatigue, and our colleagues on the panel talked about being maybe the only person of color on a board and having to continually bring up and keep DEIA in the spotlight. This is where the importance, I think they talked about the importance of building allies And sometimes that's allies within the institution, and that sometimes that's allies externally. But without those allies, the task sometimes takes longer to get accomplished. I mentioned, I believe, that boards have one employee, and the critical nature of when boards have an opportunity to hire someone who matches the values of DEIA, the values of the board and the values of the college and the district. That process is one where we are actively engaged in that process. And I think when hiring right, then those values then can be seen across all hiring practices and processes. We also look at board policies, looking at board policies with a DEI lens, and of course, looking at the budget, which is a big part of the responsibility of trustees. Setting those goals and being the model for valuing all of our students and all of our employees, that's where we want to build our circle within the trustee group, so that we've reached all 400 plus trustees, and we're building an understanding of DEI, what it means, and our responsibility to build institutions that are anti-racist.
Thank you so much, Nan. Trustee Gomez Heisenberg. Next, we have Assistant Vice Chancellor Linda Vasquez.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. I had the pleasure of moderating our executive leadership panel. If you missed out, I'm so sorry, but you'll be able to access the recording in the Vision Resource Center. I was joined by Dr. Frank Chung, who serves as Superintendent President of Santa Rosa Junior College, Dr. Lataria Hall, Vice President of Student Services at Fresno City College, Dr. Star Rivera Lacey, the first Latina Superintendent President of Palomar Community College District, Dr. Tammy Robinson, the Vice President of Instruction at Cañada College, and Dr. Rowena Tomaneng, President of San Jose City College. So if you know any of these individuals, you know that this entire panel reflects the diversity of California. They're all leaders of color. And I just will say that by, just to preface the richness of the conversation regarding the role that leaders play in advancing the DEIA work, they absolutely put students first, but they bring in their own positionality as being people of color, but the majority of them were actual products of the community colleges. They attended a community college, were recipients of EOP&S and other programs. So they bring that lens with them into the work that they do. I'll share a few highlights from our conversations. We spent a bit of time talking about what actions they're taking in their respective roles in student services, in instruction, and as presidents and CEOs of their institutions. What actions have they taken to overcome structural challenges to advancing equity work? And this, when I mean structural challenges, they could be policies, procedures, cross-sector collaboration, a lot of really good gems. Actions that they've taken and bits of advice is to champion common goals across stakeholders, drive decisions based on data and evidence-based research, also make budget decisions driven by equity, and to try new things. We joked, but not really joking, this is absolutely essential, is don't be afraid to try new things. Even if you fail, you'll learn, right? That is absolutely an essential part of innovation and continuous improvement. In light of COVID, there's this need for us to get out of our comfort zone and try new things, but also reimagining what student services looks like. Our panelists really talked about identifying mechanisms to bring supports to students, and also bringing in campus stakeholders for shared learning, in particular around lesson building and teaching and learning. A bit of advice that one of our panelists shared, and I'm going to give her kudos because I thought this was a phenomenal self-awareness and reflection, is that at-risk students become at-risk professionals. And I mentioned all of us on the panel were people of color, and there's still a bit of the imposter syndrome in our roles and in the vulnerability. And we have to remember that when we are developing strategies to support student success, but also in expanding, developing strategies to hire, recruit, and retain staff and faculty, that we have to demonstrate a belief in them, belief in their capabilities, belief that they could do well in this job, fit in our communities, and for students, that we believe in their student success. And here we are as an institution, as leaders, to support you. Because when we don't believe that, and we project that belief to our students and to our colleagues on campus, that belief manifests itself in outcomes, unsuccessful outcomes. So it's really important for us to manifest that belief and support, creating a supportive environment for our students, our faculty and staff, and our leaders, because that has repercussions and consequences down the line. Our leaders also talked about influence over power, right? What does it mean to be a leader? Leveraging your influence as an institutional leader to build common consensus amongst your stakeholders. It's not about, just because you're an administrator doesn't mean that you have the power, but you have influence to build bridges, to make equity-minded decisions on budgets, programming, and hiring. And I think the last thing I will say too is that above all of our panelists were really talking about putting students at the center of their decision making, everything from hiring, making sure students have a voice in hiring, but also in designing student success strategies. So that was top of mind. And actually, the last thing I'll leave you with is something that I was reminded of as Trustee Gomez-Heitzberg was talking about, is some of this work for our panelists, and maybe a lot of you who are on this call, these conversations are not new. You can probably look back 10, 15, 20 years ago, and we were talking about diversifying faculty and staff, equity, student-centered strategies to support their success. This isn't new. So why are we still having the same conversation? The biggest challenge that they identified in them advancing this work is time. Time being used as a crutch. We don't have time. Let's do another meeting to discuss it. Let's light the fire under ourselves. And the urgency is now, because we don't have time. Our students don't have time, right? Even a year of us waiting and meeting this out means that one more student or two more students, however many more students in a year, will lose out on the opportunity. So urgency was very much the topic of the discussion here, and let's stop talking about what it is we need to do, and let's start doing what it is we need to do. And that's my report out, Tanya.
Thank you very much, Assistant Vice Chancellor Linda Vasquez. The next report out, can we get from faculty? Cheryl and Michelle?
Yes, for
Thank
sure. So
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl, and then I'll chime in right after you.
So we were joined as facilitators in our room with Leslie Scholl and Juan Arzola. So the four of us together did a little bit of a presentation. We had 125 faculty present, I think was the peak that I saw. Fantastic folks, some incredible conversation going on in the chat, sharing of resources and approaches. And then we spent time in 4 breakout rooms and were able to engage in a bigger question, really to be committed to this work. We sometimes experience setbacks, resistance, and disappointment. And what have we learned from these lessons, and what advice or successes can we offer to others engaged in anti-racist work? And, really some fantastic conversation about recognizing that just because someone's quiet doesn't mean they're a resistor. Sometimes we need to draw them in, make personal contact, encourage their voice, and that we need to not take this work personally when we get pushback, because it's very likely, but that we need to, step back for a moment, grab our allies and forge forward. That it can be groupthink in the sense of find those allies and really work together and have that support, as well as, be able to brainstorm from new ideas and bring folks together. Leading by example, listening to others. Credit to Cindy Stevens, gave us a great acronym, PAUSE, PAUSE, and really thinking about not being incredibly responsive, like in negative ways, but postpone action until serenity emerges, so that we can be really thoughtful and deliberate in our responses while also taking care of ourselves. I need to also give credit to a student who joined us in the room. Carissa Gutierrez joined us and really just validated for us that when, including students is powerful, and that they appreciate being included and want to be heard and will share in these conversations with us, and appreciate us doing this work because it impacts them positively. And so, appreciated it and appreciated that she spoke up in the space that we had. Michelle, you want to share? So that was the first part of our session. The second part was exploring more about what commitments we were willing to make. So Michelle will share that.
Yeah, definitely. And just to kind of dovetail on to what Cheryl was saying in some of those breakout sessions, so innovative. So all of the faculty out there in the groups, like, just reminding us that we hold the position and power to engage actively and intentionally in the change. And so we're talking about everything from OER and using textbooks and dismantling our traditional mindsets of capitalism and individualism, and really taking ownership of scholarship and research, not just doing our own scholarship and research for that self-awareness part. We talked about that, but we also talked about we are the scholars, and we want to then invest our time and our energy and amplify Black, Indigenous, people of color voices in creating the textbooks and writing, so that we can change and shift how we are doing things, so that as Assistant Chancellor, Vice Chancellor Vasquez was speaking about, and I often think about Regina Sandbeck Stroud when she reminds us that it's not the time to move at the pace of the privileged. It's the time to move at the pace of those who have been historically marginalized and oppressed, right? And so that means then creating spaces, and we talked a lot about that in our breakouts, creating spaces for voices and bringing in, like, I'm so glad you had a student in your group, Cheryl, to bring in students, activates our agency, and to really mean it, and to not just posture and have, the voice, but actually actualize the recommendations, the needs, the desires, and the impacts on student success. And so one last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to share my screen in a second, is one really powerful thing in one of the breakouts, and also in the main room when we came back, was our colleagues talking about the strong, powerful leaders are vulnerable leaders, right? And to sit in that vulnerability and that discomfort, and to share that that's where we're at. And so shout out to Lisa and Melissa and a few others that were sharing, because being co-creators with our students is so powerful, and to share that with our students, that's what we aim to do. And so I was hearing that from the faculty, which is really cool. So I'm going to share the screen so you can see what we did. And then, let's see, host disable the screen. If it's possible for me to share the screen, that would be wonderful. If not, I'm going to have my colleague Cheryl put in the Padlet, our Padlet, so you all can, let's see if I can do that too quickly.
You can do it.
In the chat, where we can have you see the actual Padlet. So here
I got it,
is.
Michelle, if you want.
Oh, okay, cool. I put that in the chat. And so, and I have my version on the phone, so it might be easier too if I do that. So I want to share with you some of the really cool things as you're looking at the Padlet, since I'm not able to share the screen. Oh, yes, I am now. Ooh, thank you. Danny in the background gave me share screen. So friends, look at this. Isn't this great? I love this. So we shared a Padlet, and everyone in the faculty, we're ready. We're ready to commit There were equity champions on there. And look at this last one. I love this one. You know, it's the saying of getting into good trouble, being unapologetic. And if you see this last one here in that first column, there's a lot of faculty ready to activate and really take the next steps in their anti-racist journey, like creating the safe space for students, right? Implementing by researching and discussing and doing the work to close the gaps, right? The equity gaps. Reviewing their own student success data. And I imagine at the course level too, like, woo, yes, that's brave. I mean, when I did that, I was like shocked, like, oh my goodness, I need to do better. You know, going to conferences and trainings that focus in on racial equity, looking at Black, Latinx, API, LGBTQ excellence in STEM and in readings and highlighting. That's amazing, right? Working with CARE in everything that we do and working with our CARE programs and EOPS programs, empowering students, creating those safe spaces in our classrooms that it becomes familia, becomes tribes, becomes villages, right? That's how we learn best. And being deliberate about representation on the class materials, engaging in the professional learning, right? We talked about, like I said, OER, and amplifying BIPOC voices, digging deep, diving deep, doing that self-reflection. I mean, there's so many things to create trust. I'm scrolling through, but again, unapologetic, so many things. So friends, as you go into that Padlet, put likes, right? Put likes there, because we want to see that these are the things that we are doing and that you are affirming. Feel free to add into this Padlet things that you are all doing. You know, like, you know, what kind of reading are you doing? Like this is Kendi Stout from the beginning. What kind of DEI practices are you doing in your Senate, in your governance, shared governance committees, with your trustee work, with, you know, your employee groups? You know, how are you revamping and are you going to revamp? Like, these are some really powerful things. This is like so motivating and inspiring to me, right? Institutionalizing equity in every single part, in every single process, in every single meeting. Are you agendizing equity, racial equity in discussions to have those hard conversations, right? Staying in those conversations, as I said. And speaking up, right? You know, I know that it's so hard, right? And we have racial battle fatigue. There is that element of being triggered, but to be able to speak up, that's important. We need equity champions in every single space on our campus. And then aligning too, like our C programs, our equity and governance committees, and doing a continuous improvement that includes equity mindedness to show that those journeys, right? Pushing for the money to pay for all the professional learning. I love this, sharing the anti-racist work and spreading this. I don't know about you all, but joy is contagious. And this work is passionate and purposeful and brings me joy. And when you spread that, it's going to be contagious. This positivity and this empathy and this love for all people and acknowledging. I mean, we've got here encouraging BIPOC faculty into leadership, acknowledging the harm. We've talked about that. You know, thinking about advancement of those who have been historically marginalized. I love it. Look at all these progressive things, Cheryl. What am I missing? I mean, like,
there's so much good stuff. Another piece I don't think that surfaced in the Padlet, but in the chat, and that's, we really need to be aware that our full-time faculty have the privilege of being able to speak and push and challenge a little bit. Our part-time faculty are more threatened if they do that. So we need to be as inclusive of our part-time faculty whenever we can as possible, both as peers and then as those that have power over those positions and the decisions about whether they're teaching or not. You know, allow space for them to do this DEI work alongside us and include them as much as possible, please.
I love it. And I'm hoping that you all on the line, the over 200 of us still here on an afternoon when you could be at your lunch. I hope that you add to this, make a commitment, write it down, return back to this Padlet and see how many of us are willing and ready to do the work. As we lock arms and become that critical mass, so important as we shift and transform the largest public higher ed system in the nation. Yeah, I'm excited. I mean, that's like powerful. I don't know. I'm sorry. I just have to like,
let's make it happen.
Yes. Anything else that we're forgetting?
No, I think You can tell we're energized. What a fantastic group of faculty we had to work with, and charge us all to take that enthusiasm and do this work, and know that we have a touchstone to come back to this moment, these people, to remind us that we're not in this work alone.
Yes, I think that's, yeah, Tanya, we'll hand it back over to you unless anyone has any questions for us.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Cheryl, for your energy, enthusiasm, and sharing the real dynamic and innovative new ways of thinking and doing this work. You really mentioned so many things that add so tremendous value to all of us, even those of us who are not faculty. I want to also thank the trustees, the executives who have presented thus far. I want to take this opportunity. We also, unfortunately, HR professionals, the facilitator won't be able to join us. He has been called to duty at his campus, but I want to also create the opportunity if classified professionals, HR professionals want to chime in, just message me and I can make sure to reserve a space for you. Middle leaders led by the facilitation team. If you are interested in chiming in, I can't find their facilitator yet, so just message me. But I will take this opportunity to give a report back from the classified professionals. I want to first thank the panelists, our esteemed, innovative, engaged, energetic panelists that participated in our classified professionals panel. Ariel Davis, EOP&S coordinator at San Bernardino Valley College, Michael Parasot, human resource analyst at Shasta College, Johanna Aleman, the basic need coordinator at San Diego Mesa College, Jacqueline Herrera, the financial aid advisor at Chaffey College, Tara Lawhorn, program specialist at Columbia College, and Ben Alagi, the outreach specialist and classified Senate president at Golden West College. This was an enthusiastic group, and we are pleased to present our report back. So I think one of the ways in which we wanted to start to have this conversation is to really think about disruption and the ways in which higher education is itself a barrier for students of color. The canon and tradition, as one of our panelists said, was not designed for our students. And subsequently, when our students' effort doesn't match the expectation of the system, we shift the burden and responsibility onto them, as opposed to the system itself, which was designed for their failure. We really want to think about this opportunity to create disruption in the system and not miss the opportunities to uproot systemic racism and transform our institutions. The classified leaders were very clear about echoing that sentiment with intentionality, even if that means they argue that looking at opportunities to reevaluate what students learn, how they learn, and the conditions for which they learn. All of those conversations are at the table. We also wanted to highlight the ways in which we need to be more intentional about centering and amplifying student voices in the work that we do, being really courageous and intentional about soliciting opportunities for continuous feedback on how the system and operations are not meeting their needs, and believe them when they express dissatisfaction with their experience. This was a really key point that was communicated by many of the professionals that were participating on the panel, that there need to be more opportunities for students to participate in the redesign of our institutions. Secondarily, we also want to talk about creating holistic opportunities to support our students' socioeconomic realities. Understanding that our students come with a broad range of needs and our institutions need to be equipped, adaptable, and flexible to provide them with the resources they need in ways that are accessible and can be provided in a timely manner. We also talked about the imperative of the need to learn, lead, grow, and serve our students with empathy, grace, and compassion, and being attentive to the practice of active mindfulness in undertaking our duties and responsibilities. We are all educators. This is not our job. It is just not just our job, a responsibility to guide, educate, and facilitate students' learning journeys throughout their entire process. We also talked about eliminating barriers, because one of the conversations that we were really intentional about was really surfacing the barriers that we identified in our individual areas of supervision. And one of them was thinking about how we penalize students for their lack of understanding or knowledge of how to access basic needs, housing, and other social determinants of their success, and the imperative of being more intentional about creating opportunities to inform and empower students about the resources that they are entitled to. We also had the opportunity to surface a friction point. I think it was echoed in the sentiments of faculty as well, that in many local contexts, minoritized employee groups are engaged in what we call invisible work. And in doing DEI work, this invisible labor refers to the expectation that minoritized employees bear, quote unquote, the responsibility for creating a more diverse and inclusive culture. And we also mentioned the ways in which that responsibility, that burden to bear, is not situational, but a part of our lived reality, and the implications for the taxation on folks emotionally, psychologically, and economically to continuously bear that burden for being promoting the doing DEIA work, but doing it at all times in the expectations that they lead the work. So this is one of the really key friction points that we wanted to make sure that we raised, and it was echoed previously. So I think that is, a short summation of all the contributions, or the major highlighted contributions that classified professionals made. But I have one more thing, actually. We want to talk about, finally, the imperative of providing professional development and career advancement opportunities consistently for classified professionals. This was a point that was highlighted by classified professionals who are also serving as middle leaders, and the imperative of thinking about how we create community and opportunities for ongoing education and learning for classified professionals, so they can deepen their knowledge and awareness, and so that they can apply those knowledge, those skills that they have learned through those professional learning experiences to do their duties and undertake their duties and responsibilities that are aligned with their values and commitment to equity, to serve students even better. But that also requires a commitment from their respective institutions to make those strategic investments in their futures. So that is all, I promise, from me. I just wanted to make sure that there are any representatives from the middle leadership or from HR. If you wanted to report back, I just want to take a second to make sure if someone says something in the chat, I don't miss it. And if not, we can go to the closing. So I'll just give it 1 minute. Okay, well, hearing none, I've checked the chat. I don't see any responses. So this is the opportunity where we want to thank everyone for participating. We really want to express our sincere gratitude to the California Academic Senate and the Chancellor's Office, but more importantly, to all the presenters. Don't go, we'll have some closing remarks, but we certainly want to express our sincere gratitude for the time and energy of the Planning Committee in coordinating this remarkable 2-day event and all of those who have participated. So at this point, I will turn it over to our esteemed Chancellor, Chancellor Oakley.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Tanya, and good afternoon, everybody. Happy Wednesday. I'd like to, first of all, echo some of the remarks you just heard and thank our partners in planning and executing this conference. Most importantly, the Academic Senate of the California Community Colleges. Want to extend our sincere gratitude to the leadership of the Senate and for their commitment to working with the Chancellor's Office to surface, to highlight, and share practices and policies designed to dismantle racism and reconstruct a more inclusive, student-centered, and sustainable institution with and for our students. Together, we acknowledge that structural racism exists and that it affects the success and well-being of our students and, of course, our employees as well. And thus, consultation, collaboration, coordination of systems level change will play a critical role in achieving educational equity for the most diverse student population in California higher education and helping us to achieve the vision for success. I also want to thank all of you who have joined today, serving as presenters, as panelists, and of course, all of you in the audience. You embody the courageous leadership our students deserve. This work, as you know, requires taking risks and sharing bold ideas about the future of teaching and learning. That's something that's not always easy, but I thank you very much for showing the courage to do so. And for taking action to create the conditions for our students to achieve their academic and professional goals. We hope that you will join us throughout the year as we continue to deepen our understanding of foundational principles of equity as a theory and practice and learn from one another. We hope that what you've learned today will strengthen your individual resolve and campus and or district capacity to redesign and implement policies, procedures, and practices that will cultivate a more inclusive and anti-racist environment where our students and employees can thrive and feel accepted and very much respected. So thank you all of you for participating today, and thank you for everybody behind the scenes who made this a possibility. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chancellor Oakley. I just want as a gentle reminder that the proceedings will be made available through the Vision Resource Center, and all of the resources provided will also be made available. I also want to encourage everyone to take advantage of the survey to provide us feedback on how we can do things even better next time. So thank you very much and have a great day.